The story begins in a subway station where several people shout for help for a girl who had fainted right there in the middle. It was 11:23 in the morning in the city of technology when it happened. Our protagonist was returning from work when, suddenly, she died at the age of 23. All she wanted was to be a useful person to others in some way, and precisely because of that, she made a point of working hard so as not to disappoint anyone. But now the girl could only stare at those other people, wondering if they were the same as her, rushing around with their laptops in hand. When, deep down, everyone knew that the minute they stopped working, there would be more than 100 people willing to take their place. At the end of the day, those people were nothing more than a bunch of gears in the great machine that is capitalism, competing with one another every day to see who would stand out for being more polite or more brilliant, even though it was obvious to everyone that the function of a gear is not exactly to shine. Anyway, while our girl was being taken away by the paramedics on a stretcher, she kept apologizing in her thoughts for having disrupted people's day. Now that she was face to face with death, she wondered whether reincarnation truly existed. Because if that were the case, she wanted to be reborn as a rich woman, to have a life of authority and a wealth that no one could take from her hands. But of course, that was just a hopeful thought. Another thing that wouldn't leave her mind was why her cell phone kept glowing so much during all that time. After all, it should have turned off by then. However, when her spirit tried to touch it, it was quickly swallowed by the device. A small window welcomed her in that other dimension, greeting the girl to the land of Osek and informing her that before continuing the game, she should wait for the download of the new update to finish. After that, our girl received the manual to create a dragon. Apparently, she had ended up in an ancient land that lived in incessant war between the ancestral dragons and the half-breeds. This war had already caused extreme poverty in all nations, and the local inhabitants needed to give their all just to survive there. In addition, the long conflict had also resulted in great losses for the half-breed tribe. Because of this, the elves built a temple called the Corridor of Valor for heroic souls, using forbidden spells to revive noble warriors and form an army of heroic undead. This army of souls was invincible on the battlefield, and because of that, the elves managed to win the battle. As a result of their defeat, the dragon tribe lost its place on the divine altar and subsequently faced a genocide that lasted hundreds of years. However, despite the war having ended and a new god having been established, new problems were approaching the nation. That was because the Elven tribe, which became responsible for leading that world, ruled over all the others like true tyrants. On the other hand, the curse of the old god spread among the nations, and a new species, called White Walkers, became the nightmare in the minds of the survivors. The girl was very confused when a new window appeared, asking if she wished to skip the story introduction, an action she promptly carried out. Next, she needed to fill in her name in the system. Dear Savior, Yumi, the system is loading the scene for you. That was the next message she saw, and suddenly our girl had fallen into Pain, a vassal property of Wyston, more specifically in a nearby forest. Now she had taken on the role of a princess of that region, who had been the victim of an ambush on her way back home. The system warned her to avoid the White Walkers at all costs, because only then would she be able to reach the palace successfully and investigate the person responsible for the incident. She opened the carriage door quickly. She tried to catch her breath while processing what was happening. What did this mean? Elves? Dragons? Heroic spirits? White Walkers? What the hell kind of world was that? It wasn't possible. Had she really been reborn inside a game? Yumi wondered whether she had truly become a princess. It seemed her wish to be born into wealth had been granted. However, now she needed to understand what a White Walker actually was. But she had already forgotten what the game had asked her to do. Moreover, she felt an unparalleled cold, as if there were something behind her. That was when she realized that there truly was. Two undead were holding her hair, which made the princess scream desperately, terrified of what was to come. On the outskirts of Pain, Yumi ran, wondering why those wanderers were acting in such a strange way. They hadn't responded when she tried to strike up a conversation, so the MC didn't know why they were following her like that. In a desperate attempt to get rid of the two, the girl took off her shoes and threw them at one of their faces, immediately feeling bad for having hurt the guy. But the two wanderers stared at that object a bit confused, since they didn't know what it was. That was when she realized they could barely speak, which almost made her feel sorry for them, until the man finally dropped the shoe on the ground and the two stared at their prey, who was about to flee. The poor girl screamed as she ran and apologized nonstop. She knew she shouldn't have provoked them. But as everything bad can get worse, the girl ended up tripping over her own dress and falling hard to the ground. Yeah, now there was nowhere left to run. She stared at her fate, terrified. With a trembling voice, Yumi asked what those monsters wanted from her, until one of them pulled a lock of her hair, something she didn't like at all. As they dragged her, the girl whimpered, screaming desperately for someone to save her. Apparently, her plea was answered, because out of nowhere, someone appeared and slit the throats of the two monsters, quickly sheathing his sword so as not to frighten Yumi even more. That person approached our protagonist, assuring her that everything would be fine now. And her eyes shone when she saw that image. It was a beautiful man atop a horse. He had tanned skin and gray hair that didn't match the age he seemed to have, along with deep emerald eyes. He was breathtaking, but she had no idea who was saving her at that moment. He ordered 2 of his men to burn those corpses, and only then did Yumi understand that the young man had indeed just killed 2 people right in front of her, as if it were nothing. With a cold look toward the girl, the elf asked whether she was on a suicide mission or something like that, to be wandering around at night in the middle of that forest, which was infested with white walkers. So those weren't wanderers. They were walkers. Still a little hypnotized by the beauty of the man who had saved her, the girl thanked him for the help and asked who he and his group were. It took her a while to notice the presence of the other men on horseback, less handsome than that Greek god in front of her. The handsome man explained that they were merchants and were heading to the palace, which was a coincidence, since she was going there as well. She didn't know much about what sellers were like in that new universe, but apparently they were very different from her idea of what a merchant was. Those men were strong, as if they had trained their whole lives. Just now, they had killed 2 white walkers without the slightest effort. Besides that, their wagons seemed to be empty. They didn't even have items necessary for survival on a journey, which made her question whether they really were merchants. Yumi stared at that handsome and charming man with the certainty that she had to be very careful with that figure, whoever he truly was. But she was surprised when the boy extended his hand to the girl and offered her a ride. Without thinking much, she accepted. It wasn't like she had a better option, and she knew she had to get out of that forest as soon as possible. However, there was a small problem. The horse looked like climbing Mount Everest, because her new body was far too short compared to her old one. When she finally managed to climb up, she was feeling terribly exhausted. But that was set aside when, upon getting closer to the man, Yumi noticed a detail that had gone unnoticed. The mysterious and unknown boy who had saved her had pointed ears. In other words, he wasn't human. But if that was the case, what species was that creature in front of her? Before she could finish her thoughts, he asked the MC to sit in front of him on the horse, something Yumi questioned right away. Then the man replied that it just didn't seem very convenient to ride like that while wearing a dress. A comment that didn't go unnoticed by the other men accompanying him, who became awkward. Apparently, it was the first time a woman was going anywhere with them. Trying to offer a better idea, Yumi suggested that she stay inside the wagon. But the man insisted that there was no problem doing it his way, quickly lifting her in his arms, which made our girl's face turn red as a pepper. The young woman sitting in front of him was sure that this wasn't appropriate at all for a lady, regardless of what world she was in. But naturally, the boy simply explained that there was a problem with one of the wagon wheels, so it would be very unstable for her to travel there. Still, Yumi tried to say something to save herself from the embarrassment, only to be interrupted by the guy, who had an ironic smile on his face as he asked whether she was afraid he might try to take some advantage of her. Completely nervous, the girl only replied that no, and that she would never think of something like that. And so they set off on their journey. However, the elf couldn't help but ask why she was alone in the middle of the forest at such an hour. The girl even tried to make up the excuse that she was delivering some tools. Something that certainly wouldn't fool anyone with more than a single neuron. However, there was a certain hope that she wouldn't be caught in her lie. After all, she was wearing simple clothes and no accessories, so it was hard to suspect that she was nobility. Trying to make her even more embarrassed, the handsome man commented that he had sensed a smell of fresh milk coming from her, claiming that he had heard that young ladies of the aristocracy used a bath salt with that same scent when taking their baths. But he didn't know if that was true. That was enough to make the protagonist nervous with fear of being exposed in her own lie. She had just arrived there and had no idea how things worked in Osek. When they finally arrived at the Imperial City of Pain, the merchants received their authorization documents for entry, and the man asked his new companion to take them. There it was, the name of the mysterious man she was accompanying. According to the paper in her hands, he was the head of the merchants, Castiel Arthur Flavius Lynn. The elf smiled, confirming that it was indeed his name before asking her to keep the document in her vest. It was good to know that he hadn't been lying about actually being a merchant. But Yumi had a bit of trouble finding the inner pocket of her blouse before slipping the paper inside. That was when she realized she was a little too close to that man, whose eyes were so deep and were now staring at her attentively. The MC turned away awkwardly, a feeling she should already be used to, considering how many comments he liked to make to leave her like that. As the two rode through the city, our protagonist took the opportunity to ask Castiel why there were no human soldiers there. After all, Pain was a human kingdom. However, he explained that Pain was a vassal state of the Empire of Weiston and could not have its own army. Even the future ruler of that place had to be chosen by the Emperor of Weiston. That was new to her. How could a kingdom not have its own army? But the man added that, besides that, all the princesses of the vassal states were sent to the emperor's harem as soon as they turned 18. According to him, they became canaries, and honestly, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say they were practically prisoners of the empire. Meanwhile, the princess of the empire would have to marry to become queen, and thus rule the kingdom alongside her husband. Which probably only happened because the elves did not trust humans 100%. That left the girl deep in thought. So if nothing went wrong, she would also be sent to the imperial harem? She couldn't understand how a mere canary could threaten anyone enough for them to set up an ambush for her in the middle of the forest. But Yumi was soon pulled from her thoughts by Castiel, who said they were already arriving at the place she wanted to go. He took the opportunity to ask where the girl lived, suggesting that she must be quite tired after traveling all night without sleep. However, she made it clear that this wasn't the case, and that she was actually very good at staying up all night. She said he could leave her right there in the middle of the city, since she would find a way to get home. Without answering the question or granting her request, Castiel stopped in front of a shop and asked her to wait for him. And the girl got off the horse, just staring at him, not knowing what to say. When he entered the shoe shop, the seller swept his eyes across the place. And finally, he came out with a small pair of flats in his hands, asking the girl to try them on to see if they fit or not. Something that surprised Yumi. By coincidence or luck, they fit perfectly, and the girl thanked him with a sincere smile. However, the smile soon faded when the elf called her to continue walking, as he was willing to take her home. The poor girl even tried to dodge, asking if he wasn't busy, but that wasn't an issue for him. Now she didn't know what else to do. She had prepared an entire script in her mind, but the merchant was ruining it. That was when she pointed to what looked like a restaurant, saying that was the place. Apparently, that wasn't the most reputable place in the city, because there was a hint of surprise in the man's voice when he asked if she worked there. But she tried to stay natural, saying that it was indeed there, because they provided shelter and food for the workers. She took the opportunity to ask if he had ever been there before, something he eagerly denied. Even before entering, she said goodbye to Castiel, saying that the two of them might run into each other around sometime. He did the same, mounting his horse, at least until he realized that he didn't know the girl's name, which she promptly gave as Yumi. Then he officially said goodbye, saying, "See you around, Yumi," and finally left her standing there in front of that place she had never been to before. The protagonist looked down at her own feet. With her eyes shining as she remembered Castiel's words, she thought that he was, in fact, a very charming elf. She was now more relieved by the fact that he hadn't insisted on staying with her and going inside. She had almost been caught, but she couldn't help noticing the strange tone in his voice when he denied having been there before. As soon as she opened the door, she understood the reason for that. The women were flirting with other men with a certain exaggerated eagerness, offering kisses and drinks. It didn't take long for Yumi to slam the door and run away from there. She was terrified. What kind of place was that? Worse still, Castiel had certainly understood the situation in a very distorted way. As he continued riding, one of his companions asked if everything was all right, questioning whether the wound he already had was bleeding or something like that. However, the man soon burst out laughing at the situation. Another man asked why he had gone out of his way to buy new shoes for the girl after all. They were only going to drop her off at home. But he quickly denied any possibility of romantic interest in Yumi, explaining that he simply thought she would still have to walk a bit to get home. And so it was done. She walked a long way until she reached a very special place, the Palace of Pain. A small window appeared, informing her that she had finally reached her destination. Now, she just needed to wait for the story to finish loading in order to move forward. Sometime later, our girl woke up with the sun hitting her face, not understanding how so much time had passed. That was when she jumped out of bed, certain that she was late, freaking out because that meant her perfect record of punctuality at work was going to be completely ruined. Hearing those screams, two maids rushed into her room in despair, wanting to understand what she meant by being late. In fact, what they were was surprised to see Her Highness awake so early. That comment made Yumi realize that she was very far from her old reality. The day before, when she finally arrived at the palace, one of the guards even tried to stop her, but was soon scolded by his colleagues, who realized she was the princess, and then they hurried to inform the emperor that she had been found. She really had reincarnated somewhere else. Now she was there, surrounded by maids, even helping her get dressed. One of them commented that she didn't need to worry about schedules because the emperor himself said that she was still at an age where she didn't have to concern herself with such things. After all, there were plenty of people working in the palace. In fact, if she didn't want to take part in the preparations for the royal wedding, that was fine too. but the mention of a wedding was enough to make the girl nervous. She was soon reassured, however, when one of the maids explained that she was talking about her brother's wedding, Prince Hughes. That was because his fiancée was the pioneer princess in the Empire of Weiston Regina, the emperor's younger sister on his mother's side. While the girls did her makeup, Yumi asked whether she was the one who would become the new queen of pain. Something the woman confirmed, saying that was why the wedding had to be as grand as possible. The emperor wanted her to interact a bit more with her sister-in-law so that when she married the next emperor, she would spend some time in the harem together with her. She couldn't believe that, on top of being a little bird, she would also have to position herself in favor of the harem, which made her wonder whether the current emperor was an old and creepy man. Suddenly, someone entered the room commenting on Yumi's beauty, but that was already expected. After all, she was the blooming rose of pain. Embarrassed, the protagonist thanked them, saying it was too much and that she only looked that way because of all the jewelry and the dresses the maids had prepared. Now, all that was left was to choose the pair of shoes she would wear. But the girl had a better idea. She wanted to know where the shoes she had worn the day before were, something that caused a bit of confusion among the women. She soon explained that they were a bit lower and more comfortable to wear, so they went off to look for the shoes. Her life was very different now. The girl had hundreds of extravagant outfits, thousands of jewels, as if it were a true dream. Soon, more maids entered the room with her food, saying that she must be starving by that point. And the emperor had heard that she hadn't eaten when she arrived the day before. So he replaced the cook with one who would please her more. They served an endless variety of sweets and savory dishes, asking the girl to enjoy whatever she liked. It was too much for Yumi. She could only see glory and ostentation in that place. Her brain was already corrupted by so much luxury. After all, who cared about the fate of the imperial family? Or whether she was a peacock or a canary, she just wanted to enjoy every second of it. She had even thought that waking up before the rooster crowed was a waste. After all, she had gone to bed really late the night before, so from then on, she intended to enjoy it as much as possible. However, her peace was interrupted when a plate fell to the floor. The maid had dropped the tray after being startled by the prince's sudden arrival. He entered the hall shouting, asking why no one had warned him that the girl had woken up, questioning whether the maids there didn't consider his orders. One of them tried to explain that it was because Yumi had just woken up, while the girl watched Hughes, trying to catch his every little detail. The poor woman who had dropped food near the prince's clothes trembled as she apologized for having ruined them. But the boy only said he didn't need to hear that and ordered everyone to leave immediately, as he needed to sort out some things with his sister alone. With their heads down, the women left. Was that the brother who was going to marry the Princess of Weiston? What kind of matter could the two of them have? In any case, it was clear that the maids were terrified of him. Before closing the door, one of the women accompanying the princess looked at her with some concern, until the doors of the hall slammed shut, leaving the two alone. Hughes turned to the girl, who looked at him in confusion, paying attention as he stepped closer to her. When our protagonist called his name, the prince's first reaction was to grab her wrist and hug her tightly, confessing that he was relieved by the fact that the girl had returned safe and alive, because he had received a report saying that Yumi had died and thought that would be his end as well. Nervous, but trying to keep up appearances, our girl made it clear that everything was fine now. She had been a little startled by all that closeness, but apparently siblings in that world were just very close. Hughes continued his speech, stating that it was all his fault and that he should have personally accompanied her when she left the city. He couldn't have left his dear sister in the hands of other young men. That was new information, so it had been him who sent her to that place? He caressed the girl's lips, saying that he would never let her be the Emperor's little toy, asking her to promise that she would be his alone forever as he leaned in to kiss her. That left our girl completely shocked. Wasn't that man supposed to be her brother and nothing more than that? Quickly, the MC pushes that disgusting man away, asking what he thought he was doing, reminding him that he was about to get married. To which Hughes responds, stressed, questioning whether she was still angry with him over something so small. After all, that marriage was pure politics. And he whispers in her ear that he would find a way to make her his legitimate queen. However, Yumi makes it clear that he was going crazy because she would never be with her own brother, even if she had to go live in Weiston forever. With a frightening expression, the boy asks if she didn't think she was being very naive, because that would be committing treason, which would lead her to a death sentence. After all, that tyrant of Weiston would never accept the fact that his own concubine was a woman who was no longer a virgin. Apparently, that day was full of surprises for Yumi. But Hughes does not back down. On the contrary, he only hugs her tighter, reminding her that he was her first man and would be the last. An unparalleled rage invades the girl's body. That bastard really had some nerve. He tries to get even closer, commenting on how he remembered when the girl kept crying and begging him to stop, while crying with pleasure at the same time and wanting to hear that again. Yumi panics, telling him to stop this whole farce immediately, and making it clear that she would scream until someone came in. To her luck, one of the maids shouts from outside that Princess Regina had arrived. Yumi knew very well what that meant, and while she was there, pinned under her brother by force, she heard him grumble, questioning what that idiot was doing there and telling the girl to be very careful with his supposed fiancé. The woman enters the room with elegance, but there is something about her that surprises our girl. Something about the elf's eyes. She was blind. The woman is kind as she says that because of her illness, she had not been able to properly speak with Your Highness, the Princess of Pain, before, and as she was strolling through the garden, she decided to take the opportunity to come in and have a look. She just didn't know she would be accompanied by her future husband. The girl bows formally to her, while Hughes is completely unpleasant, doubting that the woman had only passed by at that moment by coincidence. Even so, she kindly confirms it, taking the opportunity to ask why he was there. To which he replies that he had also been walking around the surroundings. Taking advantage of the presence of her future husband, she comments that the wedding menu had not yet been decided, but she is quickly cut off because Hughes says he is very busy and that she can get out. In an attempt to save herself from that disgusting maniac, Yumi shouts, saying that she was available and could keep the woman company, which she accepts, completely honored. She seemed to be a truly sweet and good person. Thus, Yumi offers to help her, having to deal with her brother's stares. The girl takes the future queen's hand, guiding her gently. The maids watch as the two leave and are impressed by all of Yumi's care. However, that admiration soon ends when Hughes approaches from behind and asks which of the two had called Regina there. Apparently, the dynamic between the siblings was well known throughout the palace, but both deny it, saying they knew nothing about it, something that doesn't seem to convince him. Then a butler draws his attention, saving the two by saying that the person the prince was waiting for had already arrived and was just waiting for him at the Schönbrunn Palace. But before leaving, he turns to the maids, ordering the two to listen carefully to what he had to say. In his palace, those who chose to stand on the other side of the story did not live very long. Even so, they continue denying any involvement with Regina's sudden arrival, who at that moment was talking about the main dish that should be served at her wedding, commenting that she preferred lobsters because opening crabs was quite complicated. And, as noble women did not like to break the rules of etiquette very much, they would leave a lot of food on the plate, which would be a waste. Yumi watched, wondering if she really had appeared there earlier by coincidence. She couldn't help but notice the girl's stunning beauty. She had perfect skin like a porcelain doll. Only someone like her could be called a princess, and the gods must have grown jealous of that and taken her sight away. She also couldn't believe that a living goddess like her was the younger sister of that tyrant. Would her brother really kill her because she lost her virginity? Her thoughts are interrupted when Regina gets startled. She had barely noticed that she had reached a staircase and accidentally tripped on the steps, but our girl tried to act quickly, throwing herself in front of the future queen to prevent the worst from happening. With both of them on the ground, she screams in despair, asking if she was all right or if she had hurt herself, offering to check. But Regina tries to calm Yumi, commenting that it actually seemed like she was the one who had gotten hurt, and that mention is what makes our girl realize that her butt hurt a little after the fall. The situation was, at the very least, comical, and it makes Regina let out a sincere laugh before commenting that her vision seemed to be as good as hers, a comment that is enough to make our girl laugh as well. It was good to be with someone with such a gentle personality as the elf. They ended up sitting on the grass admiring the day when suddenly the woman asked if Yumi was lost in thought. But she tried to brush it off, saying she was just thinking about the menu. Sometime later, the same maids from before arrived at the garden, saying they had been looking for Regina for a long time because they needed to take her back. So the elf stood up, calling her sister-in-law to help again next time, and she accepted the invitation, taking the opportunity to thank her for what she had done that day. Although the future queen did not understand what Yumi was talking about, when she realized she had said more than she should have, our girl simply hid the truth, saying she was just glad that she hadn't blamed her for causing her fall. With a sincere smile on her face, the elf asks if Yumi would be willing to be her friend, and with all the affection in the world, the girl accepts. It was strange to think about it. Her, a queen's friend? But she knew that Regina was someone who was still not familiar with the way the Payne family worked, and her situation was very similar to her own. While getting lost in these thoughts, she noticed that she might be walking in circles, as she had already passed through that place before. Until she arrived at the Schönbrunn Palace. It was spacious. She didn't remember if, in her old life, she had ever gotten lost in her own house like that. Finally, the MC spotted other people in that immense place. They were some servants who were retreating because they were not needed there. Curious, she passed by a half-open door and couldn't help but wonder who might be there, peeking quickly through the door. That was when she found a young man sitting on the sofa. Although she couldn't see his face, he was asking someone what that person wanted to buy from him this time, and that word reminded her of someone very special, until she spotted her brother, that disgusting man inside, saying that he needed 2 dragons. The request makes the seller laugh. Apparently, before that, he had tried to buy an army, and now he wanted dragons. This made the mysterious guest ask whether, by any chance, Your Highness wasn't thinking of starting a revolution. Yumi had to cover her mouth so as not to make a sound from how shocked she was by those words, but she was even more shocked when she realized that she recognized that other voice quite well. She was still a little shocked when she realized that it was, in fact, Castiel. The man made it clear that what his clients did with the things they bought from him was none of his business, but dragons were too much. And considering that Hughes was indeed asking for them, it was evident that regardless of his plan, something was getting out of control. However, the man explained that he was only trying to make sure that nothing would go wrong, commenting that he had already been told that his help was something anyone should want. That was why he hoped Reminded Castiel would help him. The merchant explained that he was flattered by those compliments. After all, it was just a business moment like any other. However, he didn't want to discuss that at that moment since he was only there to collect his merchant's fee. From behind the door, Yumi watched everything with enormous surprise. Indeed, it was hard to understand that the same man who had helped her was the one inside negotiating with her disgusting brother. The elf quickly stood up, bowing to the prince and explaining that if he wanted to discuss anything beyond the crown's formal business, it would be better for him to leave. However, Hughes stood up desperately, saying that he would make sure he was rewarded for his help. He just needed him to lend a hand. Trying to maintain formality, Castiel made it clear that he was grateful for Your Highness thinking so highly of him. However, he was not the type of person who took sides with his buyers. After all, that was the basic principle of any businessman. Even so, Hughes tried to persuade him, saying that he was an intelligent man and knew that there was no such thing as neutrality in that world, warning that if he rejected him that day, he could become his enemy the next. His last comment made the man grow serious, and he suggested that the prince think carefully about that, because all the people who wanted him as an ally were eager to meet any enemy of his so they could show what they were capable of. Then, the elf grabbed his coat, bid farewell to Your Highness, and turned his back on Hughes. Yumi only watched all of that, not knowing whether the merchant was really leaving. However, she was surprised when she heard her brother ask him to wait a minute. He commented that he had heard that Castiel was looking for the Stone of Immortality, which was enough to make the man freeze. Yumi had no idea what that was about. To her luck, the prince explained that it was a jewel capable of curing any disease, and since ancient times, that stone had been under the protection of the Clark family. But as long as Castiel agreed to help him, he would hand it over gladly. The man turned, a little curious about the motivation behind Hughes giving that up without a second thought. After all, the throne was already almost in his hands because of the marriage. However, the boy explained that he could not go on living his life like his father, who was nothing more than a puppet under Weiston's control. So that was what he wanted, to go against Morris. And the ceremony of his wedding was his only chance to do that. Yumi swallowed hard, watching that conversation grow stranger and stranger. Morris was Regina's brother, known for being the tyrant of Weiston. Then Hughes began to explain his diabolical plan. Since the man would be a witness at the wedding, Morris would have to propose a toast to the newlyweds. The idea was to poison his wine with Cretan snake venom, which would spread through his entire body in less than 30 minutes. Before his guards could do anything, his army of mercenaries would already have surrounded the entire palace, and the dragons would be circling the area to prevent any failure. That way, no other force would be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Until he finally obtained the authority of the Empire of Pain for himself. Castiel was thinking for a moment before speaking, but he was surprised by the sound of the door that Yumi made accidentally when she bumped into the handle, making her brother shout, asking who was there. However, the elf signaled for him to stay quiet and wait, as he headed toward the door, making our girl grow more and more tense. But when Castiel opened the door, he was met with complete emptiness. He searched with his eyes to see if there was anyone there, but found no one in the corridor. That still wasn't enough to convince him to give up. So he moved on, while Yumi hid behind one of the walls, barefoot so that her shoes wouldn't make any more noise. He kept searching until he came upon the staircase of the place. The very staircase that the poor girl had run up without stopping, while being followed by the merchant. To her misfortune, she ended up stepping on the hem of her dress and falling hard to the ground, dropping her shoes. The crash was loud enough for Castiel to realize that there really was someone there spying on him. He had already reached the end of the stairs when the girl pulled herself together, running through those corridors she hadn't even explored yet. Perhaps luck was on her side, because the girl found an open door and went inside without thinking twice, fleeing from the man. Closing the door behind her, trying to catch her breath. Yumi had only forgotten one small thing. One of her pairs of shoes had been left on the floor. And of course, that didn't go unnoticed by the man who knew that shoe very well. When she realized the stupidity she had committed, it was already too late. Our girl was completely shaken. She didn't know why the hell she had chosen to wear exactly the pair of shoes he had given her as a gift. Getting close to the closed door, he called out to Yumi, who was a little shocked by the fact that the man really remembered all of that. Castiel even tried opening other doors around there while continuing to call for the girl, asking what she was doing in the palace. He even took the opportunity to tease her, asking if someone had really ordered a delivery there. She couldn't believe he remembered so many of those embarrassing details from their last encounter. When he finally reached the door of the room she was in, he realized it was locked. The merchant asked if she was the little spy behind the door, commenting that it was a big coincidence that Hughes had the same look as her, the same green eyes. So maybe she really was a member of the Clark family, the princess above all. The poor girl was distressed inside the room, trying to convince herself that all of that was madness. But she couldn't ignore it when the man sighed, saying it would be a big problem if that really were the case. After all, as she herself had heard, the prince was conspiring to poison the emperor, and if he failed, he would be blamed for a crime that would lead to the execution of his entire family. Would the princess come out of this alive? But our girl was smart enough to know that she wouldn't. The man continued, "Considering the possibility of your brother's plan succeeding, there would be a fierce battle in the palace on the wedding day. Rivers of blood from thousands of soldiers pouring through those corridors. Would you survive in that chaos and blood?" No, certainly not. That was why Castiel smiled ironically, saying that if she were willing, she could leave with him, a proposal that made her eyes shine. He went on to explain that the wedding would be in 5 days, and for that, the city gates would be opened to receive all the people of the empire who wanted to celebrate with them. And all she needed to do was look for him at the coach station the day before the wedding. Then, he would help her escape. That proposal was tempting. Truly. I myself would run away with that hunk without thinking twice. And it became even more so when the man added that if the prince really managed to carry out his plan and she wanted to return, he could take her back without any problem. Yumi's mind was racing. Should she really accept? I mean, that man had already saved her before, but the two of them were just strangers to each other. Impatient, Castiel asked whether she had already made her decision, asking her to knock 3 times on the door if that were the case. That way, he would wait for her at the station without any problem. At that point, the girl knew it was better to accept. After all, judging by the way things were going, staying in that palace would bring her nothing good. The only thing holding her back was that if she really wanted that, people would assume she was a loose woman who was running away because of a man. But, on the other hand, she no longer wanted any kind of connection with that disgusting prince. So she knocked on the door, a little hesitant. And that was enough for Castiel to try to force the doorknob one more time. She even tried to stop the door from being opened. But she didn't succeed. That man was much stronger than her. And when the two of them met, it was like the first time. The merchant raised his hands as if he were being accused of a crime, and made it clear that he didn't want to offend her. He just needed a more direct confirmation, whether she had really accepted his offer. Her face was burning with embarrassment when she thought that that man was very clever. After the first shock had passed, the man helped the princess put on her shoes. The two talked about the escape, and he made it clear that Yumi didn't need to bring any money or jewelry, because anything that could be bought with money, he would take care of. Of course, he couldn't miss the opportunity to say that she would only have to bring her underwear, leaving the girl redder than a tomato. But he went back to being serious, saying that the most important thing in the entire plan was that she must not let anyone know what the two of them were plotting, something Yumi understood without any problem. Then, he caressed the young woman's hair and sealed the deal. They really were about to run away together. Now reassured, she realized that it had all just been a joke on his part. Of course, he loved teasing the princess. It didn't take long for the day before the wedding to arrive, and one of the maids noticed that the girl was leaving the palace, so she asked where she was going. Nervous, Yumi simply commented that she was looking for her father, but the woman replied that His Majesty was already in the event hall, so she made up another quick excuse. Yumi stammered, saying that she just wanted to take a look at the kitchen to see the progress of the preparations and make sure the lobsters were fresh. It was strange to see the girl with such a sudden sense of responsibility. But since there was nothing else to say, she only asked her to wear an overcoat after all. The weather was quite cold that day. It was by a narrow margin that Yumi wasn't caught, escaping that river of blood that would gush later in the castle. However, watching Tracy walk away, she wondered whether the woman would also lose her life amid that chaos. What had she done wrong? Was it her fault that she had to leave her home to try to make a living in the palace? Castiel's words echoed in her head. You can't let anyone know about this. But she had a much stronger sense of protection at that moment. That was why she called out to Tracy, who quickly turned around in confusion. All she needed to do was not mention what her plan was. So she struck up a conversation, asking where her hometown was, to which the woman replied that it was a city called Ramil. The girl asked if there was any specialty in the city, and the woman explained that it was only golden grapes, which nobles usually offered as tribute to the imperial family of Weiston. Yumi felt a surge of excitement in her body. She finally had something to sacrifice. So she shook her by the shoulders and said that she had been wanting to eat the grapes for a long time. When she was helping Regina prepare the wedding banquet, she had heard them mentioned. Thus, she asked her to call some helpers to go with her to Ramil to get some of those grapes for the princess, warning that because of the limitation on travel expenses, it would be better for them to stay at her house. The mention of her home made the girl's eyes fill with tears, and she made sure to ask if Yumi was really asking her to go to her hometown and stay with her family. Using the limited budget excuse again, the girl confirmed it. At that point, Tracy was already crying uncontrollably while thanking the girl for the request. And that was enough to bring relief to Yumi's heart. Meanwhile, in the prison of Pain, some elves were releasing the prisoners who were being held there. All 289 prisoners of war from Pain were present. Castiel's assistant asked if they needed to take the corpses as well, since they only had 102 survivors, because they might not have enough wagons for that. But that wasn't a problem for the elf, who promptly said that they could ask other local merchants for help with transportation. What mattered was that all the men imprisoned there had to be taken back, even if they were corpses now, since no one would be left behind. His assistant couldn't help but comment that he didn't think the Prince of Pain would agree to this. After all, knowing the Emperor, if he found out that the prince had released all the prisoners of the Dragon Tribe, he wouldn't let it slide. Castiel was indignant. After all, Hughes was the one who had gotten him into that whole mess, and now he still wanted to avoid trouble with Morris? As far as he was concerned, the prince could go to hell. In the end, he gave orders for all the troops to be dispatched that very day before the wedding. As for himself, he would stay there because he still needed to wait for one more person to take with him. When the boy asked who that would be, all the merchant replied was a simple, the princess. Trying to convince himself that this wasn't true, the man asked, which princess? But of course his boss was known for being a very clever man, and replied with a smile that he was talking about Morris's bride. Meanwhile, at the border of Pain, a man had been brutally murdered, and the Imperial troops had been responsible for it. A little boy holding him in his arms asked why they had gone after a good man. After all, that was his grandfather, and he was the one who had guided the troops out of the forest safely. He didn't understand why they were trying to attack someone who wasn't a declared enemy of the Empire. One of the squires explained that they had found a package on the old man's body. It was a type of poison, according to him, and they wanted to know who had sent it to the Emperor. However, when the child picked that little thing up in his hands, he shouted that it was something else. It was a substance used to remove impurities from the lake's water. They had done that only so that His Majesty could drink clean water without worrying. The squire smelled it and then informed his master of the mistake they had made, who didn't even care, as he was far too impatient with the delay in his journey. Then the elven squire handed a bag of gold coins to the boy, saying that it was compensation for what had happened to his grandfather. According to him, it was enough for his entire family to live comfortably. After that, it was just a matter of forgetting what had happened. The boy's hands trembled as he held that bag. He would never be able to pay for his grandfather's life with money, no matter how much it was. Even so, the people of the Empire continued their journey. They couldn't be delayed any longer, leaving the boy there completely inconsolable. However, as the journey continued, something wouldn't leave Morris's mind: the image of the boy's angry eyes. He knew that he would want revenge sooner or later. So he called the soldier, who stopped quickly, to find out what his master wanted. And the man answered with an order: they must never let that child leave the mountain. As they continued their journey, something would not leave Morris's mind. 22 years earlier, he remembered when they threw a bucket of cold water in the face of a little elven boy. He was accompanying his father, merely observing the things that were happening. An aide, who nowadays was his companion, informed Your Highness that, just as he had predicted, the human kings had brought the Dragon Prince straight to his execution, only 2 days after the Dragon Emperor had died. The little boy watched the scene attentively, while his father said that allying with humans would bring no benefit to their lives, much less peace in an alliance sworn by blood. And even so, what had they achieved? A few people gathered together without the slightest discernment. The poor elven boy was imprisoned, stripped of his garments, and completely subdued there. Finally, the emperor gave orders for his servant to do what had to be done, and 2 others joined them, pulling the little boy so that he would not move, before hammering a nail into his scapula. That scene left Morris shocked. He could not believe that it was really happening right in front of him, until he heard the desperate screams of the boy who was being brutally tortured. They shouted to get one more helper there, as if they were dealing with a real animal, while they nailed the child's back. The boy screamed as his blood gushed everywhere. That was when Morris finally asked his father why they couldn't simply kill him. But the old man replied that he had already killed his father publicly, which sent the message that the era of dragons had finally ended. So it didn't matter much whether his prince was alive or dead, but he was certain he was worth more alive. And the boy understood that it was as if the people would see his father as a merciful man. After all, he could have killed that boy, but chose to be merciful. He was manipulating the hearts of the people without even trying. His comment made the emperor let out a sincere laugh. But this soon ceased when the boy asked why they were making a hole specifically in the child's scapula. Then the man explained that by doing so, they would ensure that the prisoner would never become a dragon again. Before they left there, the man was clear in leaving a very striking lesson for his son. In that world, there were no generous men. Moving to the present, Castiel was getting ready for another day of handling his affairs, when one of his servants asked whether he had taken a break during the afternoon, as he wanted to know if there was any problem with the wound he had on his back. The man suggested that they confirm whether Prince Hughes really had the Stone of Immortality, while also hoping very much that this jewel could indeed heal all wounds and illnesses, as was said in the legends. Deep down, he also wanted to be of more help to his master. But all this talk only irritated Castiel, and he asked why the boy was still there. After all, he had sent him away along with the other troops that very morning. Offended, the servant commented that he was worried about his master and therefore decided to return. The man watched time pass with a certain impatience. He knew that at 3 in the afternoon there would be a wagon transporting wine to the palace. When he was with Yumi, he had informed her that that wagon was his, so she would have to find a way to sneak in and get into the back of the vehicle. She was only a bit worried about the soldiers, but that would not be a problem, because the man had bribed all of them to ensure the success of his plan. When the MC asked what would happen if she failed to arrive in time, she was promptly scolded by the man, who moved closer to her face, making it clear that he hated people who did not keep their word or change their minds at the last minute, ensuring that she would not do that to him. When the moment finally arrived, the poor girl was in a terrible situation. She had not managed to sleep, left the palace at 5 in the morning, spent time searching for the right location at 8, and had been waiting for the wagon to arrive since 1 in the afternoon. At last, she spotted the wagon she'd been waiting for as her chance at freedom. That lit up Yumi's face, as if that nightmare were truly coming to an end. She stood up quickly to carry out her plan. However, she heard someone call her name. That was definitely something the princess had not expected. Behind her stood a figure she knew very well. It was Regina who was looking for the girl. She immediately went toward her, asking if she was alone there. To which the woman replied that she had been looking for her inside the palace, but they said there was no sign of Yumi there. Worried, the MC asked why she was trying to find her. Then the elf explained that she was a little nervous about tomorrow's wedding. She couldn't check whether everything was all right in the corridors and in the kitchen. Yumi couldn't stop thinking about the little time she had left to get into that wagon while she watched the men removing the wine barrels. But she also couldn't simply turn her back on Regina, so she said she would go with her. She just needed to be quick. When they arrived there, she made a point of describing everything to the girl. The decorations were almost complete. The chairs had the guests' surnames printed on them. The wine had also just arrived, and the chef had made some mistake with the desserts, but she didn't need to worry, as she had already called the chef from Weiston to help with that. Besides that, she had checked all the kitchen supplies and, just in case, asked for new ones to be prepared. She wanted to make sure everything was perfect. She even pulled one of the lobsters excitedly, saying that they were all very much alive, although the girl couldn't quite see what she meant by that. The future queen let out a small laugh, commenting that her friend did everything very efficiently, which was at the very least impressive. But that was an exaggeration to Yumi. Trying to hurry, she assured her that she would find someone to take her back to her chambers. After all, she needed to wake up early the next day, which would be very tiring. However, before that, the girl grabbed her arm and asked with great concern in her voice whether everything would be all right the next day. That question hit Yumi hard. She didn't know why she was insisting so much on that, and for a moment she thought about telling her the whole truth. But fortunately, the girl spoke first, explaining that she was just a little scared, but she would certainly calm down once Yumi assured her that everything was fine. She didn't know how to lie so blatantly to a friend. How could things be fine knowing that her brother was planning the worst blow he could deal? The conversation between the two was interrupted when one of the maids explained that Emperor Morris was not in a good state, so it would be more appropriate for Your Excellency to receive and keep the wine. But the other maid commented that this would be somewhat inconvenient considering the girl's poor eyesight. The mention of the drink was what most caught our girl's attention. Were they talking about the poisoned wine? She had no idea that Hughes would leave it prepared like that. Were they leaving this task in Regina's hands so that the tyrant would drink without questioning? A noise caught the girl's attention. The carriage was leaving. She didn't know what to do now regarding Castiel, who would certainly be waiting. But a better idea came to her mind. Maybe she could prevent all that disaster from happening by staying in the palace. While holding her friend's hands, she noticed that they were colder than ever. She must have been very scared. Poor thing. In an attempt to bring her some comfort, the girl took off her overcoat and placed it over the new queen's shoulders, saying that she could take care of the wine, and asking her friend not to worry about anything, because the ceremony would certainly be a success. At least it had to be. While she hugged the girl, all she could think about was that after all that confusion was over, she would apologize to Castiel for having left him hanging like that. Sometime later, Yumi headed to the royal winery. There were countless bottles there, but she quickly identified the special wine. Yumi carefully picked up the crate. She found a bottle there, pouring all of its contents into one of the buckets she had brought, and replacing it with another wine that was already there. After carefully storing the now unpoisoned wine, she went up the stairs with the bucket and poured that cursed liquid entirely onto the floor. But she soon heard a shout, asking who had done that, because now his lord's garments were completely soaked with drink. It was only then that the MC realized the mistake she had made. She had spilled the liquid on Morris's clothes and, a little nervous, apologized, explaining that she hadn't seen him. But in truth, she was ecstatic, thinking about how someone could look so divine. She was practically standing in front of a god and didn't know what to say. Meanwhile, at the place where Castiel was staying, the man had received news that some strange movement had occurred at the northwestern borders of Pain. So he ordered his men to go check it out, asking them to speak with any hunters who might be nearby as well. He knew that if Morris had really noticed something strange there and taken his army with him, the prince's plan had turned into a death wish. When he met one of his men, he asked where Yumi was, but all he received in return were excuses, so she really hadn't kept her promise. Trying to remain indifferent, the elf changed the subject, asking whether at least the prince had delivered the item he had promised them. But unfortunately, the answer to that was also no. In fact, all Hughes had given him was a letter, which Castiel took without thinking twice, already stressed. Did no one in that spoiled family know how to keep their promises? His squire asked whether that meant he would abandon the plan, but he quickly realized how stupid that idea was. The words in that letter made Castiel boil with rage, crushing the paper tightly, and throwing it to the ground while muttering that every member of the royal family was more irritating than the last. His servant picked up the letter, asking what it said so he could understand why his master was so stressed. The words on the paper were, at the very least, repugnant. It said that because the Stone of Immortality was a very special item, Hughes would only hand it over to Castiel after he delivered the throne to him. It was as if he were mocking both of them. As he watched his master jump onto his horse filled with rage, he asked whether that meant the two of them would have to go to the palace the next day to personally teach him a lesson. But all Castiel replied was that he needed to hurry to reach the northwestern border of Pain first, because he couldn't let the prince die without delivering what he wanted to him. There was one more thing that was still pending. What would he do with the princess? With no patience at all the elf said was that she could save herself. And then he departed on his horse. He didn't know why his boss was so angry. After all, it shouldn't be the first rejection he'd faced in his life. But he tried to cheer him up, asking whether he liked blondes, because he could arrange another one for him. At the palace, the servant accompanying Morris was still trying to assert himself over the girl, saying she was arrogant and ordering Yumi to kneel to apologize. She didn't kneel right away, only repeated that she was sorry, not quite knowing what to do. That was when the servant pointed his sword at her, repeating the same thing. Kneel. Finally, the tyrant intervened, saying that it was already too much, that the girl had already apologized and hadn't done anything on purpose. So he could put the sword away. All he needed to do was change clothes. That wouldn't be a problem. Despite the servant having bad news about that, since the carriage bringing his luggage wouldn't arrive until the next day. That indeed made Morris lose his temper. He asked what he was saying, whether that meant he would have to wear those dirty clothes for an entire day. What a disorganized man. The poor elf knelt as if he were about to die, saying he deserved any punishment and that it was all his fault for not having taken better care of the schedule. But the man had no pity for that. He couldn't stand wearing dirty things. And he also didn't need anyone useless by his side. So he took off the stained overcoat, throwing it on the man as if he were a human laundry basket. The boy screamed, begging for another chance. He knew very well what would happen to him from that point on. Realizing his desperation, Yumi also assumed that his fate would be nothing happy if things stayed as they were. So she carefully picked up the dirty overcoat and asked the tyrant if she could wash it and return it to him, since the whole situation was her fault anyway. She just wanted him not to remain upset about that incident any longer. Morris looked at her with a certain coldness in his eyes, but the two of them went to a fountain inside the palace, and the girl focused on cleaning it as quickly as possible. In her past life, when she managed to leave work early, she would go out drinking with her friends. And when she got home, she would usually find alcohol stains on her white clothes. But she knew her salary would be reduced if she didn't wear formal clothes. So she used isopropyl alcohol on the drink stains and some dry towels to absorb the stain. After that, most of the alcohol was practically gone. Then it was just a matter of putting a little salt on top and scrubbing with soap, and then rinsing it underwater. Morris watched all her movements carefully out of the corner of his eye, as if he were suspicious of something or whether it would even work. Yumi seemed a little surprised as well when she realized that the stain had really come out. But when she showed it to him, the first thing he asked was her name. So Yumi introduced herself formally, and the man repeated her name, Yumi Clark, implying that he knew her. But that wasn't all. That last sentence left a question in her mind. As she didn't want to waste any more time with that handsome but very frightening man, she only said that the garment would be ready shortly. He watched her as if she were the most interesting thing to look at in that place. Which she probably was, and he moved closer to pull a lock of her hair, explaining that it had fallen into the water and was now wet. Not that this was a big issue for Yumi at that moment. Finally, the long-awaited wedding day arrived, and they were already asking for the blessings of the creator goddess of that place, protector of everything and everyone, who had granted the precious souls of those present on that day. The officiant asked that she grant them eternal life and protect the newlyweds, while they, in turn, would keep their promises to protect their marriage and their lands. In addition to remaining loyal to the incredible leader of the Empire of Wyston, Morris Houseman Lancaster. While all of this was happening in the waiting room, the servants peeked through the crack in the door, commenting that the Prince and Princess of Wyston looked like a very beautiful couple. It was enough to make one jealous. One of them hadn't recognized the white-haired man until she realized that he was the Emperor, but he was indeed very handsome. Suddenly, one of the maids interrupted the gossip to ask Yumi if she wasn't going to watch the ceremony. But the girl was lost in her own thoughts. She stared at the bottle of wine as if carrying it were her last mission on Earth. She didn't need to be that nervous because she knew everything would work according to her plan. She had already swapped the poisoned wine, and she knew that as long as the Emperor didn't die, her disgusting brother wouldn't do anything, and Regina would remain safe that way. All that mattered was that as soon as that farce was over, she would look for more information about Castiel. She remembered the name of his group of merchants, so she would be able to find him. Finally, one of the women called her, asking if everything was all right because she didn't look very well. But the girl just dodged the question. She couldn't even finish the sentence because by the time they noticed, it was already time for the Emperor's toast. So one of them had to take the wine. However, the girl volunteered to do it, surprising the maids, since that wasn't the duty of a noble. But to her, that didn't matter. She already had the tray in her hands and was leaving the room. Her walk was tense. Yumi tried to tell herself that she was almost where she needed to be, and that she couldn't trust anyone else to take care of that wine in her place. Our girl couldn't make a single wrong move or everything would be ruined. Soon, her brother noticed her presence, confused by the fact that she was doing a servant's job by carrying the drink to Morris. Even so, she simply kept walking, thinking that all she needed to do was hand the wine to the Emperor. She just didn't expect one thing, something that made her eyes fill with confusion and surprise at the same time. The man standing there in front of everyone, the tyrant Emperor, was the same man from the cloak earlier. He smiled when their eyes met and asked the MC to serve him, and so the girl did. However, she had the feeling that something was very wrong, even though she had successfully switched the wine. Hughes watched the scene with an icy coldness. He didn't like seeing his sister near anyone because of that disgusting obsession with power. Finally, Morris raised his glass, while the protagonist looked at the other people there, trying to calm herself because everything seemed to be going right. He drew everyone's attention with light taps on the glass. thanking the creator for having provided food and wine for them to enjoy in such a happy moment. On that incredible day, the one he believed to be his most trusted ally had married his dear sister. So he proposed that everyone there raise their glasses and toast with him. To his new brother-in-law, the esteemed Prince of Pain, Hughes Clark, who smiled devilishly at the audience. They celebrated once again, thanking the creator, His Majesty Emperor Morris, Prince Hughes, and the new Princess of Pain, Regina. The man drank his wine while staring intently at his brother-in-law, who stared back with a bit of tension. Perhaps he truly didn't know whether the plan would work or not. Both drank everything in a single gulp, and the elf even tipped the glass to make sure there was nothing left, placing a confident smile on the prince's face, and a look of relief on Yumi's. Finally, all of that was over. She was already hurrying to get out of there as fast as possible before the crown prince noticed her presence and tried to approach. When she heard the sound of glass breaking, as Morris's goblet hit the floor, she could only hear a scream and someone calling for the emperor. That was enough to make the girl turn around instantly and run toward him. The man was lying on the ground, surrounded by servants screaming, accusing the wine of being poisoned and desperately calling his name in an attempt to wake him. But Yumi couldn't understand how that was possible. What could have happened? She hadn't left the wine bottle's side for a single second. She had watched over it as if it were a baby. It didn't take even another second for chaos to take over the hall, with rumors about an army that was surrounding the palace at that very moment. The prince, on the other hand, had already assumed his villainous posture, ordering all the doors to be closed, because he wanted all those cowards to know that that day would be the day of Pain's independence. The poor protagonist was still beside Morris's body, screaming, asking them to listen to her, because there was no poison in the wine. However, the man was not dead yet and grabbed her arm, pulling her closer. She fell onto the emperor's lap, shocked by the fact that the man was actually alive. But she couldn't say anything, because Morris pulled her even closer, ordering her to be silent at that moment. Apparently, he didn't want the other people to know that he was still alive. The situation there was chaotic, to say the least, and one of the knights approached Hughes to inform him that all the ministers of all the kingdoms had signed the Book of Independence. However, the dragon had not yet arrived there. According to the subordinate, they had found the corpses of a child and an old man on the outskirts of Pain, and their wounds had been caused by weapons that only military personnel could have. So that was a sign that the emperor was probably coming with reinforcements. But the prince didn't care about that. He was more concerned with Morris's corpse. The only problem was that they hadn't even found that corpse yet. That information was enough to throw the man off balance. How could they not have found it yet? What had the corpse done? Started walking on its own? He shouted, ordering them to find the man at any cost. In a more secluded part of the castle, the supposed corpse was examining one of his documents, saying that he hoped the Book of Independence would return to his hands, as it would serve as an execution list for the coming winter. Those traitors. Now what he could do was deal with Yumi, the poor girl who was tied up and subdued by the man. Now she heard Morris ask whether she had, by any chance, regretted switching his wine. He asked the girl not to be shocked, because the coat she had washed hadn't helped save her at all. The emperor approached, caressing her face, while confessing that he had a certain interest in her, and that if he only had to deal with the rebellion caused by his brother, that wouldn't be a problem. But there was something more in that situation that made it hard to forget the betrayal of the two of them, so he would punish the girl severely. And if she wanted to live, she should prepare for that. Meanwhile, Hughes searched incessantly for his sister. That was terrible, so he ordered his men to prepare for the worst possible scenario. No one knew for sure what to do, because if the tyrant wasn't dead, then they were. The prince quickly grabbed a box and handed it to the subordinate, ordering him to deliver it to Castiel, outside the palace. He should tell the man to send dragons to attack immediately. But the boy asked what he should do if the man changed his mind. But the prince argued that he wouldn't do that if he saw the contents of that box. After the man left, another soldier approached the prince, informing him that they had found the tyrant. He was in one of the main chambers. Thus, Hughes commanded that all of them surround the palace immediately. But before they even reached the door, it opened, revealing the image of Morris holding the poor Princess Yumi hostage with a knife to her neck. Hughes couldn't believe that the man had truly dared to come out alone like that. And with his sister, on top of that. But the elf was calm and asked whether Hughes really thought he could defeat him, giving him the opportunity to regret his actions. But that wasn't in the prince's plans, who said that he was the one giving him the last chance and that he should understand what was happening, and free Yumi at once so that he wouldn't suffer greater consequences. Confident in what he was saying, the emperor stated that it wasn't just because he had many people by his side that he had won. After all, Pain didn't even have its own army, so most of those men were mercenaries. men who fought for money, but it was pointless for them to sacrifice themselves just for the ambition of that spoiled prince. The knights soon began to argue among themselves, wondering why no one was advancing any further. And one of them explained that the spiritual race was composed of sorcerers, so they didn't know what the tyrant might be hiding. Stressed, the prince shouted for Morris to stop trying to divide his men, and warned that no one could save him now because the people who were with him had already been eliminated from the equation. Unconvinced, the emperor commented that in that case, the prince had already lost his last chance to redeem himself, and that he was very foolish to believe that he had brought all his people with him. Suddenly, one of the soldiers approached Hughes to inform him that there was an army coming from the outskirts of the northwest side toward the palace, making the prince ask which banner they were carrying. When informed that it was the Eagle Banner, he realized that he was in trouble. The Eagle Banner was the elite army of Weiston, and that information was enough to spread chaos among those men. They had spent the last 10 days without eating or sleeping, just fighting. And now they would be defeated by an elite army. Yumi, poor thing, stood in the middle of that crossfire thinking that the man holding her was completely terrifying. Even surrounded by enemies, he managed to rob everyone of their peace. The chaos ceased when Hughes shouted, asking whether his men were afraid now and whether they wanted to return to their homes. After all, their pay was 100 coins per day, working 14 hours a day. But they couldn't buy even half a gram of meat with that money. Do you know why? Because the spirit race controlled the land and all its resources, all the railway lines that transported those things. All the food they ate was priced by them. They helped this race fight the dragon race. But even so, the pay wasn't enough. And that caused great uncertainty among the mercenaries. They couldn't remain in other people's hands, and they didn't want their families to suffer hunger because of it. Thus, the prince obtained the fuel he needed to motivate the knights to fight, shouting for them to finish off the tyrant once and for all to live as true men. They kept shouting about living as men nonstop, while Yumi only watched everything completely terrified. After all, the mercenaries had gathered as quickly as they had scattered. She just didn't expect Morris to speak. And speak the truth, asking whether they really thought prices would change just because of that rebellion. They couldn't be that naive. That was when he revealed that in the 4th year, Weiston had sent 7 million gold coins to Pain so that the city could build its own railways. Another 2,400,000 went into the prince's pocket, and 1,200,000 to his assistant. To complete the projects on time even without those funds, 200 workers were forced to work nonstop, resulting in 6 deaths. Hughes only grew more and more nervous as the revelations came out. In the 5th year, they invested in lands on the southern outskirts of Pain, but diverted 6.7 million to buy seeds. In the 6th year, 1.4 million went to assist refugees. The poor protagonist, still with a knife at her neck, couldn't believe that it was true. She had dropped into that game out of nowhere, but this was absurd. According to him, Weiston allocated funds to build railways for any colonial city to reduce transportation costs, in addition to investing in land so that refugees could re-establish themselves and work. The mercenaries couldn't believe it. They thought people had simply died because they were building a railway, but now they didn't know what to do anymore. As a final provocation, the emperor asked what their hero, Hughes Clark, had been doing about all of that, dropping the bomb that the Prince of Pain was nothing but a traitor who had an incestuous relationship with his own sister. That revelation was enough to leave Yumi completely humiliated. She took no pride in that, and it wasn't even really a relationship, since there was not the slightest consent on her part. Dying of rage, Hughes shouted for him to shut up several times. Yumi also hoped that that uproar would stop, because people were starting to say she was disgusting for having relations with her brother. Relations she had never asked to have. By that point, the girl was already crying. When the news arrived that the elite army had already surrounded the palace, and that even the mercenaries who were defending the palace from the outside had fled because of that, it became clear that they didn't stand a chance. Because of this, Morris hurriedly offered 100,000 gold coins to anyone willing to cut off the head of the traitor standing right in front of him. In a desperate move, the East Prince advanced with his sword, saying that he wouldn't let him get everything he wanted. The tyrant would die that day, no matter the cost. Yumi could already see his blade shining from so close, when someone delivered the blow that severed the man's head, splashing a bit onto the tyrant's face, who didn't seem very bothered. Our girl, on the other hand, trembled at the sight. But she would tremble even more because now it was her turn. Morris lowered the cloth that prevented her from saying anything and asked her to make a suggestion on how she could compensate for what she had done so as not to die like her brother. Suddenly, a small window appeared asking her to enter the name of the commander of all that chaos to unlock the next chapter. With that resolved, Regina was in her chambers, remembering all the moments she had spent with the girl she believed to be her best friend there. The young woman stared at the distant window. She couldn't believe that all of it had been a lie. Yumi's kindness in asking her not to worry because everything would be fine. The sincere hugs they shared. Until Tracy arrived at the room with tears in her eyes, begging Her Majesty to save the girl. However, the woman explained that fornication was a crime that insulted the king. She was interrupted by the maid, who said that she herself had said earlier that all the princess had done was swap the wine. She could prove that she wasn't with the prince, and she had even already gone through all her tests. But Regina drifted into her thoughts, commenting that she was a little surprised by the fact that her brother knew about the relationship between the girl and her own brother, but she preferred to pretend that nothing had happened. She even asked the maid to return quickly to her hometown. After all, she had already received the money she needed and betrayed Yumi. So what was her intention in remaining on her knees in front of her like that? Offended, the woman explained that she still had a heart. She could even return the money. She hadn't used a single coin of it. But she wouldn't let Yumi be treated unfairly like that because she was a very kind woman and they needed to help her. Impatient, the woman ordered her to leave the room, but even so, Tracy refused. And she explained that, despite everything that had happened on that horrific day, the protagonist had been forced to do everything, and she could testify to that. There was a reason for it, because the Clarks were not all the same. In truth, the Emperor and the Prince only wanted to take advantage of Yumi so that she could give them descendants of pure blood. And that indeed caught the woman's attention. On the other side of the castle, however, our girl trembled on the floor before the tyrant who still held his blade in his hand. Curious, he asked if the MC was really saying that she didn't know how she had managed to come back to life even after what had happened in the forest. The truth was that the girl really didn't know, and what was on her mind now was the reason why Morris wanted to kill her. Coldly, he approached, caressing the tears rolling down the MC's face, explaining that he had already said everything. He was somewhat obsessed with the total destruction of his enemies. The girl tried to save herself in any way. Why couldn't he just cancel their engagement? Or, if he really hated her, he could even deport her somewhere else. However, that wasn't an option for him, because the Emperor and the Prince were dead now and she was the last living Clark. So, if he let her go free, it didn't matter which family ended up with her possession. It would result in disaster sooner or later. So, that was her last chance to say how she had managed to return to life. He asked this while threatening her with the knife at her neck once again, but just in case, it would be better to try one more time to see what happened. He didn't even wait for the girl to say anything, just ordered her to take a deep breath to prepare for what would be the most torturous death of her life. It seemed our girl was lucky, because one of the servants entered the room without even knocking, shouting that Her Majesty needed to see what had happened. The soldier who disposed of Hughes's dead body had found something very strange. He didn't even know how to describe it, so it was better for him to see it personally. But before leaving the room, Morris ordered his men to keep an eye on the prisoner to ensure that Yumi wouldn't leave. Her blood was already staining her neck, but a light was coming from her wound, almost like magic. In Castiel's chambers, however, chaos still reigned. His informant had brought the Stone of Immortality sent by Hughes. Castiel could hardly believe that he had actually received that item, so he took it quickly from his hand, opening the box carefully, and a little curious because the stone itself was not a stone, but a vial with some suspicious liquid. It smelled like blood, but his servant didn't know what that meant. And he was startled when his master picked up a knife and rolled up his sleeves, making a small cut on his forearm. He must have gone completely mad. Impatient, the elf told him to stop being nosy and dripped a few drops of the blood onto his own wound, making it glow. It healed everything, just like that. Which meant that the so-called Stone of Immortality was, in fact, this blood. But now it was too late, because apparently Hughes was already dead. The boy shouted, asking what they should do in that case. But Castiel needed silence to think. Whose blood was that he was holding? In the Palace of Pain, however, Morris arrived at the Clark family tree. Hearing his servant explain that as soon as he placed Hughes's body on the ground, the entire plant began to glow an intense red. That was curious, to say the least. That was when he heard a scream telling him to take a look at the Clark family tree. It was Regina, shouting that all members of that family had consanguineous marriages. She screamed to inform that the Stone of Immortality was not a stone, and that it was in fact Clark blood. Then finally, everything made sense. Now the only thing she needed to know was where Yumi was. But fate had other plans for her. Or rather, Castiel did. Still in his chambers, he grumbled that he should have tied his hand to hers on the very day they met. But since he hadn't done that, what he could do now was send one of his dragons to bring the girl to him. And so the beast did, roaring through the skies, determined to capture our girl. Or rather, to save her from the tyrant of Wyston. When the two entered the palace, one detail did not escape Morris's eyes. All members of the Clark family had blood-colored eyes. And his sister explained that the siblings of that family had spent decades marrying among themselves just to preserve the lineage of the Stone of Immortality. She even mentioned that the maid had said they wanted Yumi to be pregnant and give birth before going to the Imperial Palace, so they used a kind of coercion on her. When she discovered that she would spend some time there, she feared that everything would be revealed. So she took Yumi out of the palace, but she didn't expect her brother to do anything. In the middle of her explanation, the girl stopped to ask how her friend was doing. To which he replied that it hadn't been a fatal wound, so she wouldn't die. However, what mattered even more to Regina was whether Morris still wanted to kill her. He explained that now the foundation of the Empire was unstable because there were problems everywhere, so keeping her in the palace would cause even more trouble for them. Fortunately for our girl, the princess had a better idea. He could make use of her in a way that benefited him without killing the protagonist. According to her, he just had to make her the Imperial Princess. That way, she wouldn't take on any important role for the City of Pain, and he would be able to control the situation. Thus, he could decide when the time came to promote her to queen. But that was somewhat outside Morris's plans, and he argued that it would be very difficult to convince the people that this was a good idea. However, the girl argued that this was exactly what would help the people choose her. Because the more disobedient the people were, the more frightened the princesses became. They just needed to make it clear to the population that this wouldn't be forever. After all the benefits they had came from the kingdom's investments. So they would need to be loyal if they wanted to keep receiving that money. The man thought for a moment, not knowing what to say. And the silence was so great that the poor girl had to ask if he was even listening. Something the emperor confirmed. But the conversation between the two was interrupted by some noises outside, which Regina asked about, and the boy went to check. Before he left, his sister asked what he thought of the plan, but all the tyrant said was that he had never been so well taken care of by his sister and protected in that way. The girl would do anything for her brother. When he finally found one of the servants to ask about the reason for the noise, he was surprised by the answer. It was a dragon. There was a dragon outside. He didn't know who had sent it, but it was out of control. Nervous, the soldier asked what they should do at that moment. Meanwhile, in the room where Yumi had been left, the girl writhed in pain. It was true that they were healing her wounds with her powers of immortality, but it was a very painful process. A scene played in her mind of when her brother met Castiel, and they talked about the Stone of Immortality that could cure all diseases and had been guarded by the Clark family for a long time. She remembered how Morris had asked how she had come back from the dead if he himself had ordered her killed in the middle of the forest. Her eyes widened. She had finally understood what had happened. She had only come back because of that cursed stone that wasn't even a stone in the first place. But now what could she do? They must think the princess was already dead at that point, right? Yumi was still bound at the arms, but now she knew she needed to find a way out of there. That was when she noticed a small dagger lying on the floor. It was her chance. So the girl gathered all her strength to get close to it, dragging herself and pulling it toward her with her hands, even with difficulty, to cut the ropes that bound her as fast as she could. When she was finally free, she peeked through the door. It seemed the path was clear and maybe there weren't that many guards there, but she couldn't just run alone straight to the palace gate. That was when she noticed something that could help a lot with that. A horse with no rider. As soon as the girl stepped outside, something caught her attention. 2 living guards, belonging to Morris's army. There was no way back. Our girl ran with all the haste she had and the remaining strength in her body while she heard the men ordering her to stop and telling someone to inform the emperor of the escape. They wouldn't let her flee, but Yumi was already on the horse and wouldn't stop. She had gone too far and shouted for all the men in her path to move aside. The problem was that there were many of them and she was only one, so they surrounded the horse in an instant. The girl even tried to spur the animal forward, which was very nervous, and clung to it, terrified as it ran. Yumi just didn't expect to receive help from someone far more powerful than a horse, and even than Morris himself. The dragon was there, approaching all of them except the girl, ensuring that she would arrive safely wherever she went. That made her eyes shine. So Castiel had kept his promise. He really had sent a dragon to the palace. That was enough to give our girl more confidence, and she adjusted herself on the animal, ready to go far away from that nightmare. While she ran through the city, people commented about the dragon flying over the Kingdom of Pain. The girl rode on horseback, still frightened, fleeing from those men of the palace, drawing everyone's attention there. But she didn't care about that. She followed the dragon, even though she didn't know exactly where the beast was going. Inside the palace, the news that the princess had escaped finally reached Morris's ears. They didn't know what had happened, but apparently the woman had come back to life. The emperor remained silent while the aide tried to calm him, saying that he didn't need to worry about anything, because she wouldn't be able to get very far running. So he would send troops to follow her. Coldly, the man asked how Yumi had managed to escape on her own, to which his servant replied that she had stolen one of the horses, and with luck, the guards at the Gates of Pain had already stopped her. However, a dragon had helped her escape. That was somewhat absurd to think about, but they had seen everything. After all, if it weren't for that, they would have been able to stop her without any problems. With this new information, Morris ordered the aide to speak with the elite army to prepare, because they would have to go after the girl. But his man questioned it, saying that he could just send any squad to follow her. However, Morris was determined. He knew there was something much bigger behind all of that, and a single squad wouldn't be enough. Thus, the elite army invaded the city streets, drawing everyone's attention there. A little child was terrified by all that movement. After all, it wasn't normal for the squadron to be there, especially in such a hurry. While riding beside his master, the aide informed him that the princess had fled to the forest and the emperor ordered them to follow her. Yumi had no idea where she was. She only trusted Castiel enough to follow the dragon without questioning, but the problem was that it suddenly stopped. Whispering with a bit of hope, she asked if the elf was there, but she received no sign in response. So she just stayed there, lost, looking around to see if she could find any clue at all. A bit farther into the forest, the army and the emperor had already noticed that the dragon had stopped as well. So Morris gave orders for his men to wait there so that the princess wouldn't notice their presence in the forest. The owl, who was one of Castiel's great informants, found him, informing him that the elite army had already gone to follow Yumi into the forest. His servant said that the dragon wouldn't fly closer to them for fear of being discovered. That was news. How so? An elite army after just any girl? Suddenly, some of his men knelt, saying they were willing to fight that army alongside the dragon. But this wasn't the right moment to get the revenge they wanted against the emperor. If they fought that day, their strongholds in the cities would be wiped out the next day. Think of how many people would be arrested. His most loyal servant agreed with his master, saying that they needed to think about the consequences. It wasn't the right moment to fight Morris's army. They didn't even know who was inside those armors. However, one thing stayed on their minds. And the Stone of Immortality? How would they heal the deep wound on their master's scapulae? They were so close to achieving that, and they couldn't just give up. Besides that, and the princess? They had to manage to save her. If she returned to the palace, she wouldn't be forgiven by the tyrant. Castiel looked at his subordinates with a bit of coldness, before asking his owl to order the dragon to attack. The boy asked if he should attack the elite army, but that wasn't it. He should attack the princess. The other men would have other missions to occupy themselves with. They didn't know what missions he was talking about. But what was most shocking was the fact that Castiel had ordered the dragon to attack Yumi. The girl had no idea what was coming. She was just trying to find her way through the forest when she finally saw the dragon flying over her. The horse neighed in terror upon seeing the beast approaching her with its mouth open, and threw our girl to the ground. She was completely helpless. One of Morris's men reported everything that was happening there, saying that the beast had attacked the protagonist and that she was already on the ground. The aide asked if he was sure of what he had seen and what he was saying, and that seemed to be a surprise for the emperor as well. They didn't know why the dragon would do that. After all, it was supposed to be there to help her escape. That was when he realized that it was probably doing that to kill the girl once and for all. Surely the beast knew the true identity of the one responsible for all that revolt. So, in a desperate gesture, he hurried and commanded his troops to save her. The dragon was close, very close. She could practically feel its breath on her face now. Yumi trembled. She couldn't believe they had led her into the middle of the forest to kill her again just because she had heard something she shouldn't have heard. That was absurd. While the dragon roared in her face, she only thought that Castiel was a complete idiot. She was ready to die. When a blue barrier of magic formed between her and that untamed beast. A barrier sustained by Morris. From afar, Castiel and his subordinate watched the bright beams of light coming from among the trees. Finally, the princess was saved, and he wanted to know if the mission was over. Something the elf confirmed, asking that they now order the dragon to retreat. However, the boy warned that Yumi might not understand exactly what he wanted with those actions. But our man made it clear that her life was the most important thing now. That was how the girl was finally subdued, destined to become the next imperial princess, now that Morris Houseman Lancaster had officially taken control of the government. Rebuilding, developing an essential department to govern, establishing his long-standing army, our girl became the heir, despite it being against her will, and would be taken to the imperial palace as a form of experiment. After the coronation ceremony, the girl was left alone, staring at that object in her hand. While she remembered Castiel, how he had been ironic when asking if the MC was afraid of him taking advantage of her in some way, handing her shoes to change into, those shoes that fit her feet like a glove. How she had felt awkward when he said she only needed to prepare her underwear for the trip. She remembered how serious the boy was when he said he hated people who couldn't keep even a single promise, and that he expected the princess not to disappoint him. But it was she who had been disappointed when she encountered that dragon that was ready to end her life, even after, promising that she wouldn't say anything about him to anyone. Her moment of lamentation was interrupted when Regina entered the room, asking the maid to leave so that the two of them could be alone. Yumi could only look at her out of the corner of her eye. She had no energy for anything. But the woman explained that there were people waiting for her outside that dark room, and she wanted to know what the princess was thinking. When she noticed the protagonist's silence, Regina asked whether she hated her for what she had done. Before Yumi could even respond, the woman explained that she knew that when she tried to stop her at the gate that day, she began to have doubts about their friendship. But even so, she still tried to help her because she didn't want Hughes to hurt her in any way. And finally, she revealed that she knew the late prince had already hurt his sister. She was a blind woman, but certainly not a stupid one. The girl heard Yumi's tears and held her arm, asking her not to hate her and apologizing, because it had never been her intention to hurt her. She was truly sorry. She knew that no one deserved to go through that. Finally, our girl managed to gather the strength to say that she didn't hate Regina at all. She only hated herself. She couldn't do anything, couldn't change anything. It had always been that way, even in the past. And she hated that about herself. As she broke down in tears, the girl admitted that she felt like the most useless person on planet Earth. However, Regina hugged her, denying all of that, because it wasn't true. But that wasn't enough. Yumi thought she was weak, because even the decisions about whether she lived or died had been made out of pure mercy from someone else. Hearing this, the girl held her friend gently and made it clear that this wasn't true. She needed to listen. She wasn't a weak woman. Weak people weren't anything like her. In fact, our protagonist was someone who cared about other people. She cared about justice and equality in that world. She held her friend's hands and commented on a story her mother used to tell. According to her, long ago, there was an emperor who didn't know how to fight and didn't have good strategies, but he was kind and generous. He also didn't have an immense territory, but he knew he could count on his people because they trusted him. And Yumi could be someone like that. But the woman argued that she wouldn't know unless she tried to take on that role, and then reminded her that now the MC was an imperial princess, a reality that seemed distant moments ago, but no longer. And precisely because of that, she wanted to know how her friend wanted the world to be, because now she could turn that reality into something better. Finally, our girl stood up, accompanying Regina. And still with some tears on her face, she explained that she would like to live in a world where good people were valued and could give their best every day. It was a very good way to see things, so Regina said that if she really wanted that, she had better become stronger, so that she could finally create a world exactly like that. The maid called the two of them, completely interrupting the moment and saying that they needed to go right away. Even with all that conversation, Yumi had no desire to go. After all, Regina's brother still wanted to kill her. But the girl asked her to call her Gina, while placing a small satin ribbon around her neck and asking her not to worry, because she would help her with whatever she needed. Before they left through that door once and for all, Yumi called out to her friend Gina to ask why exactly she was helping her, and the girl replied that she looked very much like someone Regina had known. Someone who had already gone to unimaginable places and given her own blood just to protect her. A strong and brave woman. She didn't even let the girl think too much about her answer, just pulled Yumi along, calling her to leave already. The two of them went down the stairs of the Palace of Pain, probably for the last time. And the first thing Yumi saw when she reached the bottom was Morris. He was already in different clothes and atop his horse with the same serious posture as always. She only looked at him out of the corner of her eye, nervous about all of that. The elf, on the other hand, looked at her with an indecipherable expression. Before she could enter the carriage, however, the Emperor ordered the girl to stop and asked her to come closer. He wanted to know what that was around her neck, but the girl only replied indifferently that it was a silk scarf. She didn't know what that reaction was about, but if there was no problem, she would very much like to leave there right away. Making the fabric slide through the man's hands, that brought a memory to his mind. Jasmine. He remembered a woman with a wound on her neck a little larger than that of the girl he so despised, saying that Jasmine suited her very well. And the woman kissed his head, stating that she loved everything the little boy gave her as a gift. Later, in the city of Blumenthal. The aide returned to the palace. He arrived trying to catch his breath because it had been no easy mission. while his master kept the same expression as always. He greeted him, and Morris dismissed the other servants who were there. Since the man had arrived alone, the emperor assumed that he had not found who they were looking for. And that was indeed the case. It had been 5 days, and even after sending countless orders, one of the empire's servants still had not returned. That was very strange. After all, his subordinates were unable to resist any order given by him, so there was only one possibility. The knight had been kidnapped. Trying to understand if he was understanding correctly, the aide asked if his master was saying that while they were saving the princess, someone had kidnapped one of the servants. The army men didn't know who would have enough power to do that. Then the emperor asked him who he thought would have the greatest interest in his servants. It could only be the dragon race, but that was impossible, because theoretically, their prince had died. Or at least, that was what he thought. Morris, on the other hand, did not believe that at all, despite the aide swearing that he knew the prince had died. Because 10 years earlier, he and his family had been deported, so they had to hide in a mine and work there. But after an accident, the fairy emperor sent one of his men to confirm the death of the dragon prince, yet all the bodies there were just pieces of flesh. Trying to continue the subject, the servant commented that they could even capture one of his servants, but they didn't know the truth. Besides, they were in the light and their enemies in the darkness. So how would they manage to find him? But Morris said he didn't need to find anyone. Just let them return. In the meantime, all he needed to do was take very good care of the princess. And then he changed the order so that the captured servant would attack his kidnappers instead of simply returning to the palace. That order seemed a bit confusing at first, but soon the aide understood and carried it out without resistance. Meanwhile, at Castiel's castle, his servants said that they couldn't just keep Morris's soldier tied up with that chain. Everything seemed very wrong. But the man looked at him seriously, until he heard the sound of iron breaking. He ordered the boy to step back while drawing his sword. It didn't take even a second for the knight to lunge forward and free himself from those chains. The two engaged in combat, and the man's sword was not exactly enough to make the knight retreat. It was as if he felt no pain, regardless of the blows he took. Castiel, on the other hand, was already tired of it, sweating as he resisted the knight's attacks. He gripped the sword firmly, before striking that thing, severing one of its arms. However, to his surprise, there was no arm beneath it. It was an empty suit of armor. He didn't know how that was possible, nor had he ever seen anything like it before. And that surprise distracted him long enough for his servant to have to shout at him to pay attention. However, it was already too late. The soldier grabbed him with full force, striking exactly at his weak point, and threw him against the wall. The noise drew the attention of the other elves who were with him, and the man gave orders for them to bring the chain back to restrain that thing. Our boy's wound was already bleeding heavily by that point, but he still tried to remain standing, fighting against all that metal, and trying at any cost to break free. When he finally managed to do so, he didn't hesitate to grab his sword and drive it straight into that being's neck. But all that happened was that its helmet fell to the ground, completely empty. The servant approached his master, asking if he was all right, extremely worried about his old wound, and shouted for them to call the doctor immediately. However, Castiel was more concerned with understanding how that creature worked, so he asked them to bring its helmet. According to him, there was some kind of light coming from inside it. And when he finally examined it, he was surprised. It was a blood spell, with some names and numbers, almost like a code. So he ordered his servants to copy those data, because the army had to be controlled with those things. But his companion overrode the order, urging them to hurry and call the doctor immediately. Another thing that wouldn't leave his mind was the reason for the delay in finding the princess. After all, she had been captured by the tyrant, so she must be somewhere. However, our girl was a little far from Morris at that moment. She asked her coachman whether the imperial princess wasn't supposed to live in the imperial palace. And that was the case because they had taken her to the harem. But the man simply replied that it had been an order from the emperor himself. It had already been a few days since she had arrived there, and at that moment, Yumi was busy begging to be allowed into the emperor's room, but his servant said that he was busy at the moment. The problem was that he had been busy since yesterday. With a face like a puppy that had been left behind during a move, our girl begged, please, to be allowed in, because she had something very important to discuss with the man. She needed to find a way to make him agree to let her study at the prince's school. Regina had explained that it was there that princesses and princes studied. Even though they were kept there almost like hostages, they were trained to take over the rule of their nations, and they could only return to their cities of origin after the emperor died. Regina even advised her friend to attend those courses. However, the girl commented that her father had already died, so she just needed to know when she could return. To which the woman replied that, in that case, she would only return when she had her brother's approval. She spent some time racking her brain trying to figure out how she would get that approval, and getting a spot in the courses might be the best way for now. While she was still humiliating herself in front of the guard, one of the women from the harem arrived accompanied by 2 other girls, asking who Yumi was. The woman was called Maria and seemed to be well known there. She had a small pot in her hands and explained that she was going to see the emperor and wanted to take some wine to him. The servant took the opportunity to quickly introduce the new imperial princess, and the 2 greeted each other somewhat awkwardly. However, Maria soon went inside, leaving Yumi indignant, asking why she could enter while our girl had to stay outside humiliating herself. But the man only replied that everyone in that palace, even the servants, knew that she was the king's favorite. At least now our girl knew what kind of man Morris was. The 3 who went in started gossiping, asking whether Maria had heard the rumor that the emperor only let the imperial princess live there because he liked her. After all, she was a very pretty girl. But the elf seemed a little irritated as she said that they should stop gossiping, because the emperor was not like that. She didn't even know what he could see in that girl. And one of her loyal followers commented that she was right. No one could compare Yumi and Maria. After all, she was the woman known as the most beautiful in the empire. She would definitely be the emperor's official woman someday. Trying to put an end to that, Maria just said that they didn't need to speak so aggressively either. They should just pretend that nothing was happening. It didn't take long for them to return, finding the poor protagonist still there in front, waiting for her chance to enter. With falseness in her voice, Maria commented that she must be very tired and invited her to a tea party in her part of the palace someday. An invitation that our girl accepted? It wasn't like she had much of a choice, to be honest. God knows how much time passed while she stayed there. Until Morris's aide finally came out of the emperor's quarters and personally called her inside. The 2 walked through the corridors until they reached the emperor's office, announcing the arrival of the imperial princess. He dismissed the man, asking him to clean his desk, and he did so. When she noticed the pot he was carrying in his hands, it became clear to our girl that that was not the last kettle Maria had brought in. But there was no time to talk about that with Morris. He soon asked why she wanted to speak to him personally like that. Since she didn't like to beat around the bush, the protagonist simply asked, please, that he allow her to study in the prince's hall. When he questioned why such a sudden request, the girl explained that if she wanted to be a queen, she needed to learn many things because otherwise she would disappoint her subjects. And that was not something she wanted. But the tyrant coldly asked whether that only bothered her because of the rumors about her in that palace. But the MC had no idea what he was talking about. So Morris stood up, explaining that people were saying he had only let the girl stay there because he wanted to take her to bed. That was absurd, and made Yumi's eyes widen immediately. So, curious, the elf asked why she had that look on her face. And nervously, she replied that she had no intention whatsoever of acting that way, and didn't need to care about that kind of thing. The 2 were very close. Far too close for the girl, who didn't even know where to put her face after hearing that. However, the man lifted her face with the tip of his glasses, and asked what she would do if he were indeed thinking about taking her to bed. He slid the temple of his glasses down the princess's chest, stopping at her blouse before reaching a very forbidden place, and asked whether she would dare refuse his request. Our girl was embarrassed, red as a pepper. In my opinion, she wouldn't refuse anything he asked. She didn't even need to answer, because the man already said that she was very easy to disturb, and that her wanting to become queen was nothing but stalling. An empress couldn't let other people see her weaknesses, especially her enemy, whoever that might be. She didn't know why he kept trying to scare her like that. But he wasn't wrong in saying those things. She couldn't go around carelessly showing her weak point. So, trying to remain firm, Yumi made it clear that he was not her enemy, something that seemed to surprise the tyrant. Even so, the girl maintained her posture, asking him, please, not to see things that way. She knew she needed his approval at any cost if she wanted to leave that place. Then she praised him, saying that he was very talented. Perhaps the most talented man she had ever met in her life. However, she knew he wouldn't be able to handle everything alone. That is, he was a very worried man, so he needed someone competent by his side to help. Hearing that was almost comical for Morris, who asked whether that meant the girl thought herself competent enough. But our girl's confidence could only go so far, so she awkwardly denied it, explaining that she wasn't yet. But she was a studious person, so he could allow her to study in the prince's hall. Her argument drew a small smile from the emperor. Even so, he explained that she couldn't study in the prince's hall, but attending the classes was her only option, because the hall was not appropriate for a woman to go alone. That was good enough. The girl had to restrain herself from jumping for joy like a puppy right then and there. However, there was one more thing the tyrant wanted to discuss with her. The president of the trade chamber, Castiel, had gone to the palace a few days before the rebellion, and Morris wanted to know whether our girl knew him. The mention of that name was enough to send chills through her entire body. But what wouldn't leave her mind was Regina saying that she would be able to leave that place and return to her kingdom once she obtained her brother's approval. So she decided to act according to her desires. And she managed to get to the prince's school, saying goodbye to her classmates after another day of class. She remembered how she had lied straight to Morris's face when she said she didn't know Castiel. She knew that although it was important to gain his trust, it was still too early to stand by his side. He didn't even seem to be a bad person, or he wouldn't have put his men to accompany her while she was out. She knew that wasn't just to protect her, of course. He also wanted to keep an eye on what the girl did or failed to do. During her trip, she noticed that she had never thought about what was actually beneath those armors. Regina had already commented something about how there was no man inside them, so were they empty? She wanted to know more about the details of that, but didn't know how. Finally, she arrived at the harem. She was received by the maids, who informed her that Regina was already waiting for her inside. Upon hearing her friend's arrival, the elf stood up happily, asking if Yumi had already returned. She was surprised to find Regina there, especially since they had already agreed that Yumi would eventually visit her at her palace. However, the woman explained that she had already heard that the protagonist was being supervised every day, so it wouldn't be very convenient for her, right? Changing the subject, the woman asked if our girl knew how to play chess. And luckily for her, she did. She wanted to know more about the girls' first day of class while they played amicably. They sat down and, a little horrified, Yumi explained that when class began, the princess had already managed to irritate the teacher. They removed a screw from his chair and he ended up crashing onto the floor. That was very unnecessary for grown men, but there wasn't much to be done. While they played, they guided all the moves so that Regina could visualize everything in her head. She didn't know what to expect from the men there. Two of them commented that she was very serious and that she didn't need to be studying all the time. They knew they had to wait for their parents to die to be able to return to their cities, so it was pointless. One of them even commented about her brother, since they knew she must know what had happened to him. They were very aware that any effort there was useless. They were mere pawns of the emperor at the end of the day. However, she added that when the teacher resolved the chair issue, he assigned a small activity to take home. And Regina asked why she had returned so early if that was the case. Hadn't he assigned an activity to her as well? But she explained that they didn't do assignments during class time. Changing the subject a bit, she commented about a new dancer there at the prince's school. And of course, the men went crazy wanting to see what she looked like, how big her bust was, and her lower part as well. They even invited Yumi to go along, which seemed a bit comical to Regina, who burst out laughing. The woman commented that she had heard that the women at the prince's school were even more beautiful than those who stayed at her brother's palace. And considering that all beautiful women were sent to the school, that was a great comment to make Yumi remember Maria, the very pretty girl, perhaps the prettiest in the entire empire, who had been there when she tried to visit Morris. Regina's expression changed completely, and she was surprised by the fact that Yumi had met her. However, she suggested that her friend keep her distance because she was Uncle Kaiser's niece, and she had been sent to the palace to assume the position of queen. She had heard that she was only sent there to be the mother of the next prince, and her uncle would make Morris grant her the title if she were pregnant, regardless of whether it was a boy or not. Apparently, the rumors about the tyrant having an affair were not just rumors, and he knew how to hide it very well, considering what she had seen the other day. They continued playing and talking, and the woman let it slip that her brother wasn't wrong. It wasn't possible to learn everything and all things at the prince's school. So she questioned whether her friend really wanted to continue attending, especially since it was quite far from her new residence. But that was like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Yumi. In fact, that very day, a new teacher had arrived at the academy, the Secretary of Agriculture. It seemed to be news to Regina that Onye was teaching the princes something. And apparently he was a great teacher, because our girl commented that he was very kind and knew many things, but didn't act in a selfish way. In fact, she had to do one of her assignments shortly. And grabbing a hoe that was nearby, she asked if she could plant anything in the land that was available there, which was a rather unusual request. Not even Regina understood how the girl was going to do that. But she explained that basically her assignment was to understand how to increase land productivity during prolonged winters. After all, the winter there lasted almost 10 months. But her friend commented that they still hadn't finished playing. She just hadn't realized that Yumi had checkmated her. That was absurd. The maids checked the board to make sure that was correct. After all, the princess had learned chess from a very famous player in the Yisha family. Yumi, on the other hand, had learned in kindergarten. Of course, the maids didn't know what kindergarten was. That was something from the real world. But maybe it was better than Yisha. As the girl went out to plant whatever it was, Regina called one of the maids, asking if the emperor had already found a new chess tutor. And since the answer was negative, she asked them to spread the rumor that the imperial princess had managed to defeat Princess Regina until it reached her brother's ears. Far from there, at Castiel's castle, one of his servants informed him that the princess had attended the prince's school, but she was being supervised by the elite army the entire time, and then returned to the harem. That was a good reason for it taking so long for them to locate her. He didn't know the girl was being kept with the others in the harem. Besides, with the elite army close to her, it wouldn't be easy at all to get close. But Castiel had a great plan, and said he would go there personally. When the boy tried to argue that the tyrant's guards were not easy to deal with, the man explained that he had a great way to do it, infiltrating using the armor that had remained from the ghost knight. Sometime later, in the royal library, our girl was carrying a stack of books, until an envelope flew out of one of them, falling to the floor and catching her attention. She quickly bent down to pick it up while the maid who was accompanying her held the stack of books. The sender was the father of one of the girls there. Not knowing exactly what to do, she decided to put the letter back in its place inside the book and asked the woman to take the books to the garden, while she would take care of carrying the other materials. However, one of the knights stepped in front of her, carrying the rubber and the pieces of metal she had in her hands. It was 8026. That was how the knights were identified. Only numbers, no names. The two finally arrived at the garden, and the girl took the material from his hands, saying that she could take care of it by herself now. One of the maids who was there was quick to take the girl's boots inside. She thought she wouldn't need them, perhaps, while Tracy asked why her mistress had bought so much steel and rubber. But that was something she would see with her own eyes later. The girl spent the afternoon doing calculations and studying, designing things for Mr. Onye's class. All of that while the knight watched her attentively. When she finally finished her calculations, it was time to get her hands dirty. She took some strips of steel and moved forward. She didn't even realize she was about to make a mess. But luckily, 8026 held the metal bar before it hit the ground. Yumi was very focused on whatever her project was to say a single word, and she tied those metals as if she were already used to it. The knight, whom we knew very well, took a look at her papers in the meantime. He crouched down beside the girl, watching everything carefully. And when he noticed that she was having difficulty tying one bar to the other, he offered to help. That made our girl wonder if all the servants of the Empire were that intelligent, and she couldn't help but comment that 8026 was very kind to her. It was like having a robot boyfriend. She ended up venting a little too much by saying that he was being controlled, and she was too. Their fate was not in their hands, and because of that, she thought the two of them were very similar. However, she soon realized that talking to an empty suit of armor was useless. He couldn't even understand what she was saying. Even so, she was very grateful for the man's company and for him helping her complete her task. Now that she had assembled the tent, all that was left was to plant the seeds themselves. She didn't know why the people there had never thought of using a greenhouse after all. The winter there was very long. Maybe they thought that because of the properties of rubber and resin when they were in contact with water. There was only one more thing missing: a thermometer. Actually, two. Her boot wasn't there, and she was sure she had set it aside earlier. And the knight had noticed it too, because he remembered the maid who had taken the girl's boots away. Without much ceremony, Yumi decided it would be better to do things barefoot. She knew she couldn't dirty those shoes with mud, or the stain would never come out. It was interesting the way she acted, considering she was a princess. But there was something that caught 8026's attention. There was a piece of glass on the ground. On a protective instinct toward the girl, he quickly pulled her before her foot touched the grass. And the two of them ended up falling hard to the ground. Yumi didn't understand the reason for that movement, so she scolded him. That was when she noticed the shards of glass in the soil. She had no idea why they were there, but now the poor thing was covered in mud, so she offered to clean his armor so that he wouldn't receive any complaints. She seemed almost like a grumpy girlfriend complaining that he had to stop moving around because he was very dirty. She positioned herself in front of the man, who looked at her attentively, and went down his body, or rather his armor, to clean everything that was there. When she reached a very special place, the poor thing was trembling, but Yumi just told him to open his legs already. That was too much for anyone, even for a supposed ghost knight. And when he saw her getting closer and closer, he pushed her head away, which left our girl somewhat confused. He seemed a bit strange that day. She couldn't really explain why. Until one of the servants called the girl, explaining that Princess Regina had asked to invite her for a snack, interrupting her activity and saving the man by a very small margin. 8026 watched the girl leave, and only when he was sure that he was alone did he remove his helmet, revealing the beautiful face of Castiel, who was now more than relieved by the fact that Yumi would go to the prince's school the next day. He wouldn't be able to endure that heat flooding his body for another second. He remembered how she had commented that he was like her robot boyfriend, and the innocent face she made when he stopped her from cleaning places she shouldn't clean. He didn't know where his head was at, but he was sure that woman would be his end. The next morning, the Imperial Princess's carriage was already waiting for her outside, but she was surprised by the presence of the aide there, who explained that he was patrolling the area and asked that both she and her accompanying knight slow their pace. However, when the man passed in front of the Emperor's right-hand man, he noticed that there was something strange. Fixing his eyes on the back of 8026, or rather, Castiel. When he asked the servant to stop, that caught Yumi's attention. Quickly, the aide began to use his powers, but Castiel knew he couldn't let that happen. So he drew his sword in an instant, revealing that he was not one of the thousands of knights controlled by the Empire. The man shouted for the gates to be closed, and Castiel pulled Yumi's arm toward himself, making sure that she would not escape from there, or that anyone would take her away from him again. The man shouted to protect the Imperial Princess, while Castiel tried to use his sword at the same time as he held the girl's face. She didn't quite know what was happening, but the whole situation was strange. They were surrounded by men in the blink of an eye, until the man plunged his sword into the ground using one of his powers, to form a kind of whirlwind and throw all his enemies far away. While they were still on the ground, he ran with the girl in his arms, hearing the desperate shouts of the true workers of the castle, saying they couldn't let him escape and needed to follow him. Luckily, he managed to get far away, locking himself with the girl in one of the many rooms of the castle. When they were finally alone, Yumi found an opportunity to ask who that man really was. And just seeing his pointed ears and dark hair was enough for her to know who was under that armor. Castiel's face surprised her and left the girl flustered, as he always did. He apologized for the dragon having scared her the last time they met, but wanted to know if Yumi was all right. He needed to know how the tyrant was treating her. But for her, everything was fine. The girl even received a head pat that left her red as a ripe tomato. The man puffed out his chest to say that she didn't need to worry because even if they closed the gates, they could still escape through a hidden tunnel that existed there. He just hadn't expected the girl to say that she didn't want to go with him. That made Castiel release her hand quickly, asking what the girl was talking about. Yumi repeated, still without much confidence, that she couldn't go with him. But the man explained that staying near the tyrant was something very dangerous. Something she countered, because for Yumi, staying with him was even more so. That put a well-known ironic smile on Castiel's face, who asked the girl to explain better what she was saying. So she said that she imagined he already knew what immortality was, and questioned whether he was risking himself that much just to get a little of her blood. She wanted to know why he needed the Stone of Immortality so badly, because after taking her to his castle, what did he intend to do? Lock her in a room and show up to take a little bite out of her every time he needed her blood? Not even in her wildest dreams would that happen. The boy got a bit worked up, pinning her against the wall and commenting that her line of reasoning was very interesting. He wanted to know what kind of books she had been reading in the library to know that kind of thing. She tried not to fall for the provocation, being firm in saying that before knowing what the man's true intention with her was, she would not accept leaving there. Castiel slowly approached her face, making it clear that he didn't need her consent. He could take her with him whether she wanted to or not. It was as if he were a completely different man now. But our girl didn't give in, arguing that it didn't matter what he wanted with her. She just needed to scream so that the guards would enter there and arrest him. However, that gave Castiel a great opportunity to provoke her even more, whispering as he asked if that was really what she wanted. A bit embarrassed, Yumi replied that she could scream very loud. Then he spoke softly in her ear that she could show him how to do that. She was about to ask for help when he sealed their lips in a kiss, an intense kiss. He didn't let words escape from Yumi's lips for even a single second. And she gasped, trying to resist that burning desire for the man in front of her. When he finally separated their lips, the boy asked if she still wanted to scream. The poor thing was no longer even a tomato. She had turned into an erupting volcano from how much heat she was feeling, asking what he had just done. Thus, squeezing her cheek, he replied that he had only done what boyfriends do. But boyfriends? That was when she remembered when she said that the knight was like her robot boyfriend. She had no idea it was him who was under the armor. The girl asked how long he had been hiding, and the man replied that about 3 days or so. Now, yes, she was mortally embarrassed. He had been present in the room where she slept, while she changed clothes, and even while she bathed. But that last part offended him, after all. He wasn't that kind of person. Finally, the guards arrived making noise, and Yumi said it was better for Castiel to leave. However, he wouldn't let go so easily and called her in a sweeter way, suggesting that she become his woman. His real woman. Of course, the girl wasn't going to accept it. She just commented that he was very sly and that she would not be his woman. It was almost absurd how far he would go to get what he wanted, but She wouldn't be fooled, so she just pushed the guy, saying it was better for him to get out of there or she would be the one in danger, since she had told Morris that she didn't know him. That, yes, was news. So he really was investigating Castiel. He opened a secret passage to the tunnel while the girl explained that this was indeed the case, questioning whether he hadn't gone to the Emperor's palace during his stay. As always, Castiel didn't answer. He just tossed a little bundle into Yumi's hand and asked her to keep it. She couldn't accept that money, but the man convinced her by explaining that she would need cash there. That way, at least she could bribe her servants. Otherwise, she would be in trouble. He took the opportunity to remind her of the glass incident that had happened the day before. Our girl knew she wasn't welcome there. Anyway, he turned his back, saying goodbye to the girl and telling her to take care, but she asked if he intended to come back. As usual, he turned with an ironic smile, saying that he was a very worried man, but if she missed him, who knows? He didn't even finish speaking when the girl slammed the door of the secret passage shut in a rage. She knew he just wanted to provoke her. The next day, at the School of Princes, Professor Onye praised the work done by the group the girl was in, adding 10 points to their average. One of them stood up to say that they hadn't done anything, but the other covered his mouth, whispering that he had probably received some kind of bribe from his father to pass them. However, Yumi stood up, thanking the professor for the compliment. At snack time, they sat together, and it was somewhat unbelievable for the boys. The fact that she had done the group work completely on her own and only wanted an ice cream in return. For her, there was no problem. They were classmates anyway. Even so, the boys insisted that they owed one to the protagonist, and finally introduced themselves. Philip and Green. Yumi did the same with her usual friendly smile. Now more than ever, she felt that asking to attend the School of Princes had been the right choice. After all, the more friends she had, the more help she could get. But the peaceful atmosphere soon fell apart when the boys commented that she had ended up doing more harm than good. Because now people thought they were nerds and didn't want to hang out during recess. Which wasn't a problem for Philip, who only cared about watching the dancers who were there. They lamented because surely both of their families must have been quite worried seeing that they had suddenly become elite students. They even commented that next time they would stop the girl from doing any work. They really were a bunch of idiots, and that only made our girl want to hand in a 200-page presentation next time. Changing the subject a bit, Philip asked to ask her something. Everyone was curious because they knew the girl lived in Morris's harem. He didn't even need to finish the sentence for her to know it would be something absurd that he was going to ask. So she just denied it, saying that the two of them didn't have that kind of relationship. Poor Green threw a stone at his friend's head, asking if he had no sense at all of how to talk to a woman. He couldn't go around asking that kind of thing, especially the first time they sat together. But his argument was that his friend also wanted to know the answer to the question. Their commotion was only interrupted when Professor Aonie approached, calling for Yumi. She went over, wanting to know what it was about. Then he explained that the Emperor had seen her work personally and really wanted to talk to the girl in person. That was a surprise. She was used to maximum rejection from Morris. But the two went to his chambers, and when they arrived there, nervousness quickly took hold of the girl's mind. She greeted Your Excellency with as much formality as possible, receiving a side glance that was not friendly at all. That didn't shake her. She should be used to it by now. While looking at the work done by her, he asked if that was everything. But Aonie answered, explaining that those were the results of the first week of planting, which meant that the girl wasn't finished yet, but would hurry with it since winter was already approaching. Morris drummed his fingers on the table, a bit thoughtful about what to do. And our girl was very nervous, still not knowing exactly what she was doing there. That was when she decided to say something, explaining that everything would be ready soon, and that they were also testing some things in the laboratory. Aonie added that after the experiment was concluded, he would ask one of his groups to improve whatever they identified as flaws. And Morris agreed with that, asking them to present the new plan as soon as possible. Changing the subject a bit, he asked if there was any position available in his department, to which the man replied that there was the advisor for affairs responsible for local agriculture and the recorder of the sessions in the conference hall. Then, surprising everyone there, Morris asked the girl directly which position she would prefer to take. That was madness. He really was offering her a job. Her chest filled with joy just thinking about working again. So she explained that she wanted to stay as an advisor alongside her professor. She knew she could learn a lot from him, and her sentence made Aonie smile kindly. However, all that joy didn't last long, since Morris replied that she would be the recorder of the sessions then. It took the shine right out of the poor thing. Why had he asked what she wanted if he wasn't going to do that? But Aonie tried to smooth things over, saying that this person was responsible for recording everything that was discussed in meetings, so it would help the Imperial Princess a lot in the future. It was only then that Yumi understood that the Emperor was thinking about what was best for her. Before leaving, the professor asked the tyrant to take a look at the letter of recommendation he had written about Yumi, as it showed quite a bit of appreciation for the girl. The girl also thanked him, saying that she wouldn't disturb the Emperor in his work anymore, so she would leave. However, he had other plans and told her to stay to play chess with him. Apparently, that day was indeed full of surprises for our girl. When she sat down for the two of them to play, Morris struck up a conversation, asking how she escaped the thief on the day Castiel invaded the castle. So she explained that the tunnel was quite wide. Thus, when the man went in, she ran out and closed the door, and apparently that door only opened from the outside. Continuing his moves carefully, he asked whether, by any chance, the guy had struck up any conversation with her. But the girl denied it, and took the opportunity to ask whether, by any chance, he had been captured, explaining that she wanted to know if she would be in danger again. But the Emperor explained that she didn't need to worry about that because, next time, his team would be ready. And the tunnel had already been sealed from the outside of the palace. But that didn't interest him. Insisting on his investigation, he commented that the thief had stayed with the girl for 3 whole days. So it was strange that he hadn't said anything to her. Even so, our girl insisted that she didn't know anything. The moves continued in deeper silence, which was only broken when Anye handed the letter of recommendation to the king. He observed the board attentively before turning to our girl, who was crumpling a packet of cookies. That made her refuse another sweet. Maybe she was overdoing it and needed to keep the appearance of a good girl in front of Morris. Anyway, she made her final move, checkmate, which threw Anye off balance, and he made a much more exaggerated signal to the girl this time. The tyrant, in turn, just glanced sideways. Yumi had finally understood what the man was trying to say. She shouldn't beat her king. Trying to correct her mistake, she volunteered to change the move, explaining that she had made a mistake and didn't want to make that move. However, she was stopped by the Emperor's hands, who told her to place the piece exactly where it was. Serious, he asked whether she was trying to deceive him in some way. Something the girl denied, explaining that she didn't even know what he was talking about. Then, the man resumed the earlier conversation. He couldn't believe that inside the armor there had been a human all that time, and only she hadn't noticed. However, the girl had a good argument. She didn't know how his servants normally acted, so there was no way to compare. Even so, the man insisted, saying that she played chess in a very decisive and strategic way. Very different from how she acted in her normal life, and he had already met several women like her in there. Nervous, Yumi explained that he was misunderstanding everything. It was just that she didn't live the same way she played chess. After all, chess was a game, so it was just about using her knowledge. The pawns were just pieces of wood that she didn't hesitate to use. But humans were different. They were living creatures. They had feelings and emotions. So she couldn't treat her friends, her family, and her boyfriend that way. Her words seemed to penetrate Morris's mind, who released her quickly, repeating her words. Friends, family. Did she really have a boyfriend? Something the girl denied somewhat awkwardly. She didn't know why all the men she talked to loved leaving her like that. Taking a sip of his tea, he asked that from then on she go to his room after dinner. That was the last straw. Was he really trying to go to bed with her? She couldn't even ask that question because Anye volunteered to explain that he wanted her to be his new chess tutor. Of course, it was only temporary before finding an official tutor. It's not like she had a choice, so she just accepted. The man also signed the letter of recommendation written by the professor and asked the girl to take it to Human Resources. After that, she could pick up her uniform and would start working the next day. Yumi's eyes practically sparkled just seeing that. She couldn't believe she would finally go back to work after so long, so she thanked him immensely, making it clear that she would try her best. But Morris had already run out of social battery and said that she could leave immediately. Something the girl did, skipping around with joy. When only the two of them were in the room, the assistant commented that he remembered the boy used to say the same thing she did when he was a child, about pawns being just objects and humans living creatures. However, completely cold, Morris said that he only said that when he was a child. But now he had grown up. He was almost 20 years old, so saying that kind of thing was, at the very least, idiotic. The professor let out a sincere little laugh. He agreed with him to a certain point, but he knew Yumi was a good girl, and the Emperor wanted him to keep a discreet watch on her. Far from there, in Castiel's castle, his servant celebrated his return. The trade guide had sent a message saying that he had almost been caught, and that had scared everyone there. However, he stopped his words when he noticed the blood staining his clothes. Trying to calm the man, Castiel made it clear that it wasn't his blood. He had just run into some monsters on the way home, and there was no need to worry about that. When he realized he was alone, he asked about the princess. whether he hadn't managed to escape with her or whether she had chosen to stay there. While stroking his pet owl, the boy explained that it had been a while since they had seen each other, so Yumi no longer saw Castiel as her last hope of being saved. He could continue that conversation, but he remembered that Raleigh from the economics department, who had received some money from them a few months earlier, had returned. And he needed to know whether he should dismiss him or whether his boss was in a condition to receive him. That was a great moment to do what he had to do. He would just take a bath first, but asked him to wait in the guest room, handing over a paper for him to give to the man, asking him to raise the price of all those things as much as possible. They were random items: metal, cement, zinc, rubber. He had no idea what the young master would want that for. But with the most roguish smile possible, Castiel just replied that he needed to make an effort if he really wanted to capture his favorite pet bunny. Sometime later, at the conference palace, Onier was introducing Yumi to the ministers when one of them questioned whether she really was the imperial princess, commenting that she must be quite talented, since being a session recorder was a complicated role. From afar, Morris and Anglo commented that that day would be quite hectic, even though the servant had some hope that things would go better than expected. They watched our girl attentively as she distributed her usual friendliness to the men there. For her, it truly was an honor to be there. The Emperor was a little surprised that she was genuinely happy to take on a job. The minister's conversation only ceased with the approach of Morris, who walked among them with the same serious air as always while greeting them briefly. However, the man made a point of casting a sideways glance at the MC, who instantly changed her posture, lowering her head to greet the tyrant. But she was surprised when he walked straight past her. He didn't seem happy for some reason. In any case, that wasn't Yumi's problem, since he himself had allowed her to be there. When the meeting began, one of the ministers announced that monsters were destroying the cities of the south. Apparently, the people were calling this event the Curse of the Ancient God. There were also some refugees going to those villages, but they had already arranged accommodations for these people, as the Emperor had ordered before. Yumi knew that, in truth, people believed all of this was the fault of the dragon tribe. She had already asked everyone she knew, and they explained that these monsters were created by the dragons, even though no one could actually prove it. She was doing quite well for a first day, instructing ministers who wanted to send any documents to the Emperor as if she had been doing it for a long time. Apparently, the elves wanted the winter to last longer to slightly reduce the damage caused by the monsters, since every year these creatures brought catastrophe to any imperial nation. However, with a prolonged winter, they would have to deal with other problems, such as a lack of food and essential items, and a lack of work for refugees. To her, it was clear that the biggest problem was that, even though humans were protected by the elven race, they had no power. So, until they could defeat the monsters on their own, their independence was out of the question. Yumi even remembered that Philip and Green had commented on this before. While she sank into her thoughts, the girl noticed that the piles of documents around her only kept growing. Would she be able to handle so much work every day? Or rather, even if she managed to keep up, would Morris have time to read all of that? In the middle of the meeting, one of the ministers commented that the economics department had rejected the agriculture department's project because the budget was 3 times higher than estimated, especially considering the prices of steel and rubber. That caught our girl's attention, since she was the one who had written that report and was sure she had checked everything. If she knew the truth, she would be even more shocked. Serious, Morris analyzed those papers attentively, trying to understand the situation. He immediately turned to the girl, already regretting having put someone like her in charge of such an important matter. The poor thing was not pleased either. It was her first day, and she knew she had no margin for error with the tyrant, but she swore up and down that she had done everything right. The man called her over, extending the document and informing her that, according to the price of those materials, the economics department really couldn't accept the project. When the girl analyzed the papers, she became a little disconcerted to see that the values there were indeed absurd. While the man explained to the tyrant that relocating the refugees cost them a lot. In addition, the agriculture department had asked to reduce their taxes due to the decrease in productivity caused by the winter, something that impacted the entire economy. Another minister added that even if taxes were reduced considering their annual production, the farmers wouldn't be able to pay everything. Therefore, he suggested, charging no tax at all, which could be good for the people's view of the government. But that wasn't common ground at court, since one of the men said that before coming in with philanthropy, he needed to know how much money he had in his account. That was enough to install chaos in the court. On one side, some shouted that they didn't have the same amount as Raleigh in their accounts. On the other, others yelled that this was madness. Morris had no patience for that and simply sat stone-faced on his throne, waiting for the men to finish their shouting. When they finally calmed down, the man explained that the priority was to increase crop productivity the following year. In addition, everyone knew that food prices were rising and farmers were already using their food reserves to keep things stable. And he knew that the economics department was doing well. Families had even bought a new country house. Or would he need to send someone to check ownership of the house? Hearing that was enough to make everyone bow before the tyrant, begging forgiveness for what they had been saying. Even poor Yumi was already kneeling, and she hadn't even uttered a word since she arrived. That man might be a Greek god, but he was still very frightening. Raleigh defended himself again, explaining that they really didn't have enough money to survive that year. Caesar had used a good amount of money to maintain the army, and since he had the king's signature, they couldn't refuse. That was new. Had he really requested money for the military force? That was when the men realized that something was wrong. Morris knew nothing about this, which meant his signature had been forged, and that was unacceptable. Yumi watched everything very attentively, vaguely remembered Caesar, something about him being someone who always caused problems for Morris. But she had no idea that the entire military force of Weiston was in his hands. Colder than ever, the emperor made it clear that no one would leave that court until they resolved this problem, giving orders for the guards to close all the doors immediately. Once again, the men there trembled like cowards, bowed on the ground and begging their master's forgiveness. Raleigh tried to explain that they had already checked the numbers several times and would only be able to give the pre-established amount to the agriculture department, which meant they would only have money to cover a quarter of the costs, considering the abusive increase in material prices. Onye told him to shut up, since it seemed the man was trying to make the situation worse. But the man retorted, arguing that the person responsible for the problem was the one who should find a solution. The murmuring among the ministers echoed again through the room, at least until Morris repeated Raleigh's words about the culprit having to find the solution to the problem. Quickly, he turned to Yumi, who had no idea why he was staring at her like that. Then the girl said that he must just be stressed and had spoken without thinking, since if even the entire economics department couldn't solve it, imagine her. But that didn't seem to matter much to the man, who only asked whether she wanted to be a session recorder forever. That was when the girl understood. To become a queen, she had to complete all the tasks her emperor gave her. She had to see it as an opportunity to stay in good standing with His Majesty. Soon, a small window appeared, giving 2 response options to Morris. "Please, let me handle this," or, "Your Majesty, I just want to be a session recorder." It was more than obvious to Yumi that she should accept the challenge, so she asked the emperor to let her handle it. No matter how difficult that task was, she needed to do well at any cost. Thus, Morris declared that Yumi Clark would take charge of the agriculture department's problem to help the economics department of Weiston. Wishing good luck to the MC, who accepted gladly, knowing she would need it. With that resolved, the girl leaves the conference hall, calling out to Onye to ask whether the economics department could contribute more money, to which he replies that only if the emperor were willing, but he found it difficult to speak with Morris given the circumstances. Even he did not have the courage to speak with the emperor. He didn't want his family to go hungry because he miscalculated his own steps. Even so, the man asks Yumi not to worry too much about it, because Morris would find out who had increased the prices of the materials and that person would be harshly punished. Changing the subject a bit, the man wishes that the student manages to complete her task without further trouble, asking her not to let anyone take advantage of her. She was about to ask how she would solve it under those conditions when Onye suggested that she could ask Morris directly for help, or try to make a bet with him. The suggestion leaves the MC even more confused, but the man explains that she just needed to act as if she were. Irritated when they played chess. That idea was absurd, and Yumi was smart enough to know it wouldn't work. Even so, Onye continues, explaining that he could teach her how to do it. She just had to keep moving her shoulders nonstop while she was with the king. However, our girl claims that the guy would kill her if she did that. But the professor doubted that very much. At the end of the day, Yumi arrived at Morris's chambers to continue her chess tutoring as planned. She seemed lost in her thoughts during the moves, as if that were the last place she wanted to be. She remembered the attempt at bargaining she had made with a merchant, who only said that the price was absurd, even during such a miserly government. She even tried to insist, helping the man carry some boxes, but he only repeated that there was no way to help at the moment. Morris watched the girl in silence. He realized that Yumi was far away, even though she was right in front of him. That was when he took the opportunity to checkmate the girl, who jumped up from the chair indignantly. He calls one of the maids to ask her to bring some snacks since they would take a break. Yumi looked at the tray arriving with indifference. She couldn't even think about food. She was so tense. Then she decided to just drop the bomb already. She wanted to know if he couldn't ask the economics department to give a larger budget to the agriculture department, arguing that if it were the elf making the request, they wouldn't be able to refuse even if they wanted to. However, the man stands up, explaining that even though he was the king, when he needed to make a decision, he still had to ask for authorization from the kingdom's departments. Otherwise, he would become a dictator, and he didn't want that. That caught Yumi by surprise, because in her mind, he already was a dictator. Her face didn't hide her thoughts, making Morris question the reason for her expressions, but she brushes it off, commenting that he seemed to be a very busy person. She asks if he didn't have to read all the kingdom's reports, because if that were the case, he must be very tired. The man looks at her as indecipherable as always. It was never possible to know exactly what was going on in the tyrant's head, until he explains that if he didn't do his job well, he would have even more work to do. And pouring himself a drink, he continues, asking whether the girl had thought about finding a foreign supplier for Weiston to solve the price increase problem. To which she replies that she had researched it, but those suppliers only accepted working under a minimum 3-year contract. That interests the man, who asks whether they accepted advance payment in the first year. That takes the girl by surprise, making her ask whether that meant they would deposit the entire first year of the 3-year contract. But that wasn't a problem for Morris, who explains that they were simple materials, so they couldn't buy everything at once. After all, the economics department itself had already said they didn't have that much money that year. The real problem for the girl is that, in that case, she would have to travel outside of Weiston, something she thought would be impossible, because technically she was a prisoner of the Empire. Teasing our girl, the Emperor asks whether she hadn't said she wanted to be useful and show her talent, or was it just to impress him? She stands up quickly, stating that it hadn't been empty words. At that moment, she even thought that Morris didn't treat her so badly. She could even believe that he was a good king. He had even allowed her to go to the School of Princes in the meantime. Changing the subject completely, the man comments that the MC had lost 8 rounds of chess that night, and if she couldn't focus on the game, she would end up ruining his good mood, which wasn't much to begin with. Desperate and afraid that he might give up on the proposal, Yumi apologizes, assuring that she would focus again to improve her master's mood. That makes him smile. He seemed genuinely satisfied with the reactions he caused in our girl. She notices that the Emperor was drinking alone, so she offers to keep him company. His eyes were deep as he looked at the girl, who downed her drink as if she were at a club with her friends, and excitedly said that it was his turn. She was definitely excited about the trip she would make. As night fell, Yumi also fell asleep right there on the sofa in the Emperor's office. Anglo entered the room to ask whether he wanted her taken back to her room. But surprisingly, Morris said that wasn't necessary because it was raining heavily outside. The servant comments that he heard that the Imperial Princess had worked a lot that day, and even helped the local merchant carry his materials, something the Emperor didn't care much about. He only asked that someone clean the guest room. And then he carried the girl himself, carefully so that Yumi wouldn't wake up. As he carried her to the room, he remembered that he asked how she dared to drink so much in front of him, to which the MC replied laughing and saying that she couldn't believe any man in that world trusted Morris. When he asked what she meant by that, the girl only raised her glass and explained that he was the Emperor of Cleanliness, while Anglo asked his master to forgive her for saying so much nonsense. Now, the tyrant looked at her closely. He even seemed to have a bit of affection for the girl in his arms, muttering loudly that if she didn't know how to drink properly, it was better not to start at all. The next day, the girl woke up in Morris's harem completely confused. She had no idea what she had done the night before, and now all that was left was to pray that she hadn't done anything inappropriate. When the maid entered to announce that breakfast was served, the first thing Yumi wanted to know was where the king was, to which she replied that he was in the meeting hall. Our protagonist was doing her best not to panic right there. She had to focus on doing a good job so as not to stress Morris even more. After all, a good boss would never harm his most talented employee. Thus, the girl went on with her duties, heading to the port, to meet the head of Weiston's commerce and remind him that he had said he could take her to their supplier. But the man explained that they did not want to sign new contracts with clients who were not trustworthy, to which the MC replied by explaining that she would represent the entire country and was very trustworthy, so he didn't need to be so wary. Stressed, the man asks whether she was aware that working for the government was something that took time and involved a very bureaucratic process. She couldn't just do whatever she felt like. Besides, it wouldn't be convenient at all for the supplier, who lived in another country, to come meet the girl. Prices were already as low as possible, so there wasn't much he could do. Even so, Yumi insists that the seller had said the client needed to be trustworthy, so she wanted to know who he was, suggesting that the leader of the Merchants Guild could be a good person for the job. Nearby, Castiel watched the scene while having a little coffee. It was interesting to see his little bunny acting in such a desperate way. The man remained firm, asking who she was talking about, because all they had there was the head of the local food market, and that wouldn't help at all. However, she had someone else in mind, the Emerald Guild. Hearing that made the man look at Yumi as if she had said the greatest absurdity of the century, leaving her somewhat confused about what she had said. But he only said that he didn't know she had such a strong sense of humor. After all, how did she know the leader of the Emerald Guild? The man controlled all the commerce of Osku. The MC didn't even notice when the boy who had offered to help her escape that whole situation passed behind her, because she was too focused on convincing that man that she did, indeed, know the guild leader. While Castiel and his servant boarded one of the boats, the merchant asked whether the girl at least knew what the man did for a living. The elf finally found his client, who was waiting patiently on the boat. Continuing the conversation, the princess asked whether he didn't have to negotiate, but the seller replied that he also did negotiations, but with the guild it was different. The emperor bowed to greet Castiel, who was more than respected there. He presented his product carefully, and the contents of that small box lit up the monarch's face instantly. It was crazy to see that scene from the outside, because the emperor even kissed the elf's hand, who, theoretically, was socially beneath him. Continuing the subject, the seller explained that the leader of the Emerald Guild even controlled kings of several countries, which seemed like an exaggeration to Yumi. However, the man explained that with the amount of resources he had, he could promote whoever he wanted to ascend, as long as that person also had enough power to help him. That was how he gained so much political power. Realizing that the girl didn't know this, it became clear to the man that she didn't know the leader at all. However, Yumi and he couldn't be talking about the same person. She was sure that the whole speech was based on bar talk. Trying to get rid of the subject quickly, she asks where she could find the guild leader, considering that his members had already said he wasn't around. And the man whispers that he had heard rumors about a beach house in Pearl where the boy threw a big party full of important people, from kings and queens to shady people with a lot of power. Yumi couldn't believe that Castiel was busy partying. She asked where that house was, but the man said he had no idea, and ended the conversation as he was already leaving. His cart sped away, leaving our girl completely lost. Who could she ask about that beach house now? From atop the boat, the elf amused himself with the protagonist's desperation. Until a random man handed Yumi an umbrella and she hadn't even noticed it was raining, she was so focused on finding Castiel. She asks who asked him to give her the object, but the man only replies that he didn't know, just that this person had asked him to deliver an envelope along with it. She couldn't believe what she was reading. We invite you to the party at the Emerald Guild House on Pearl Beach. It was an invitation, but that wasn't all. There were some instructions on the back saying that she didn't need to return the umbrella. She just had to find its owner. Her eyes sparkled at the thought that Castiel was there. If only she knew that our boy never took his eyes off her. The girl wandered through the port, scanning everything with her eyes. Now that she knew the elf had seen her and was nearby, she wouldn't rest until she found him. And more than that, he knew that Yumi was looking for him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done anything for her. But the question that wouldn't leave her mind was why the boy hadn't come to find her in person. Still searching, the girl came to the conclusion that if the seller could see her at that moment, he was probably somewhere high up. She looked at all the houses around, but there was no sign of Castiel. At that point, the MC knew that the issue wasn't that the boy didn't want to find her, he was just avoiding it. Now it was more than clear. That absurd increase in the price of the Empire's materials was because she hadn't run away with the boy. After all, no one else knew that Wyston needed those materials. He really was a complete idiot. That was when something caught her attention. A ship leaving the port. That was it. Castiel must be on one of those boats. From afar, she saw the figure of that man forming on one of the vessels, standing still like a statue. She had finally found him, and her eyes shone upon seeing again that handsome boy who had been so careful with her in the forest. Even though she still thought him an idiot, it was hard not to admit that he looked good no matter what, especially while staring at her with that ironic smile on his face. As the boat moved farther and farther from the shore, the boy said a clearly articulated, "See you later," to make sure the girl understood everything, waving at her as if all of it were nothing more than a little joke. Yumi, on the other hand, couldn't have been more stressed. It wasn't possible that she would really have to go to that party just to talk to Castiel at this point. She shouted his name several times, hoping he would order the ship to come back or something like that. But when she realized that definitely wouldn't happen, she could only curse to the four winds, certain that the next time she saw him, she would say all of that straight to his face. On the day of departure, the girl asked Regina not to leave the carriage as the port was not safe for her to be unattended, so the woman decided to give the news right there. According to her, dealing with the matters of the economics department was only the beginning. After that, he wanted to remove all of Caesar's men from the department. This caught Yumi off guard, as the girl had no idea that the man had people infiltrated in there. But Regina assured her that this was true. In fact, she herself was responsible for gathering evidence of it. and she added that her friend's success on that mission would be a great opportunity for things to improve. The MC was already ready to leave when the woman asked her to be careful with Maria, because she might stay in her corner in the palace, but she couldn't guarantee the same outside, especially after Yumi had slept with her brother. That last part made the girl shout that that had never happened. She wished it had, but of course she wasn't going to admit that. The trip went on calmly, at least for the people around the protagonist, because she herself could only think that not all the water in the world would wash away all the sins she had committed. Her friends approached, a little curious to know what she was thinking about to be so quiet. Green, foul-mouthed as always, questioned why she was with the deadly widow, but the MC had no idea who they were talking about. Until he explained that they were referring to Regina, because she had married twice and both husbands had kicked the bucket. Trying to defend the poor woman, our girl said that it hadn't been her fault, that she had only sacrificed herself for the empire. But Regina had never hated anyone, besides being the most talented person Yumi knew. The guys tried to explain that it was just a stupid nickname, but the girl had already exploded, adding that her own reputation wasn't the best either, and even so, she was friends with the two airheads. They defended their friend, saying that they knew her and knew she was nothing like the rumors. She was an intelligent, sweet, and very kind girl. Besides, she didn't even need to worry, because the two of them would be with her at the party. But the girl snapped back at that chatter, saying that the two of them just wanted to go to the party anyway, which left both of them offended, even though it wasn't exactly a lie. One thing that made the two curious was why the tyrant had allowed them to go with Yumi. Philip even commented that when his mother got sick, he still had to stay at the School of Princes. She didn't know what to answer. It really was strange. The girl hadn't even had to ask anything. Morris was the one who suggested that her friends accompany her without giving any further explanations. Suddenly, a ship approached the boat the group was on. The three stared at the vessel, somewhat confused until they realized they were pirates. Philip was the first to back away, saying that he was very scared and asking how a pirate ship had made it there. The ship's captain soon spotted the princess, smiling disgustingly as he claimed that he had been waiting for her all day, and he ordered them to hand the girl over to him in exchange for the lives of the two. She couldn't believe they had gone all that way just to capture the MC. Green drew his sword, shouting for his friend to protect her while he dealt with the pirates. The MC didn't even have time to think before Philip pulled her to his chest, which was strangely soft. He threatened the men, saying that if they were there just for money, all they had to do was name a price and he would pay double. However, the captain laughed in his face, asking who said they had come that far, just for money. Meanwhile, in Morris's office, his sister commented that she thought he had sent some of the kingdom's knights along with the group, to which he replied in the negative, explaining that they would draw too much attention and that would end up bringing even more danger. Besides, it wouldn't be good if other people found out that the Stone of Immortality, in this case Yumi, was traveling outside the country. However, the woman explained that Maria had been acting very suspiciously, talking to people from outside the palace, and she was very afraid that her friend would get into trouble because of that. Calmly, Morris just replied that if the MC couldn't overcome any obstacle on her own, why would he need her by his side? That answer caught Regina by surprise. She didn't think her brother could be so cold. Honestly, neither did I, but he got the nickname Tyrant for a reason. On the ships, the atmosphere remained tense. The pirates were losing badly, thrown to the ground while trying to recover. The captain, on the other hand, remained intact, laughing and commenting that Green was a good fighter, but he wanted to see how long he could keep it up. He gave orders for his men to finish him off once and for all, and a group surrounded him with their swords. Yumi and Philip watched everything in fear, knowing that their friend wouldn't be able to handle all those people alone. Besides, the MC had seen some explosives inside the invaders' ship. Suddenly, someone pulled the princess's arm, dragging her away from her friend, who shouted for the princess. She fell hard to the ground, being treated like a real piece of meat. The men even commented that they had received good money to capture her. One of them caressed her face, stating that she was very pretty, and that it would be a shame if they simply killed her there without doing anything. Which made the captain put a disgusting smile on his face, asking if they shouldn't have a little fun with the MC first. However, Yumi bit the finger of the thug holding her hard, and heard his scream ordering them to kill her already. He just didn't expect Green to reach him, kicking his face while sending him to hell for that. But on the other side, another pirate restrained Philip, saying that no one would leave the ship alive that way. The friends were completely vulnerable, and the captain's blade almost caressed the girl. So close it was to her chest as he asked if they still wanted to resist. Even Green had to retreat, because there was nothing more he could do. At least that's what he thought. Because suddenly, several Navy ships approached the boat, throwing explosives and flares at the pirate ship. Philip turned to see what was happening and was more than happy to realize that those ships were indeed from the government, which meant they were safe. The troops shouted for the pirates to drop all their weapons immediately as they were under arrest. That was when Philip found a very familiar face. It was his father, who shouted upon seeing his son. The boy cried from desperation and relief at the same time. It had been a long time since they had seen each other. The boy was even taller than his old man now. He took the opportunity to ask how the man knew they were in trouble. But the man said he needed to check Philip's hair before anything else, leaving him confused. He continued, explaining that they had cut a lock of his son's hair, and Philip had no idea when or how that had happened. Then he explained that Morris had ordered the Navy to be sent to follow the princess to ensure that nothing happened to her, and had sent a piece of the boy's hair. Now, yes, the boy was lost, until his father made it clear that it was a warning that if the emperor could cut his hair, he could cut his entire head. The man asked whether Morris had discovered anything, to which Philip replied in the negative, since he himself hadn't said anything. Yumi interrupted the conversation between the two when she noticed a stain on her friend's pants, asking as delicately as possible whether he had hurt his butt. And I'm gonna stop here, guys. What did you think of the story? I love fantasy with romance, especially when there's intrigue and suspense mixed in. I'm honestly obsessed with Yumi and Castiel together. Like, my god, I've always wanted an elf romance. Did you guys like them too? Drop your theories in the comments because I need to know. I'm seriously rooting for this ship to move faster so we can see these two 100% together while they're still trying to survive and deal with all this political chaos. If you're into stories like this or want a continuation, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the Misa Manhwa channel. The story is called A Princess's Guide to Saving Dragons, and I covered it up to chapter 28. Kisses, and see you next time.